Careful by Edith Wharton, published 1916. "You ought to buy it," said my host. "It's just the place for a solitary-minded devil like you, and it would be rather worthwhile to own the most romantic house in Brittany. The present people are dead broke, and it's going for a song. You ought to buy it." It was not with the least idea of living up to the character my friend Larrivain ascribed to me. As a matter of fact, under my unsociable exterior, I have always had secret yearnings for domesticity, that I took his hint one autumn afternoon and went to Careful. My friend was motoring over to Quimper on business. He dropped me on the way at a crossroads on the heath and said, "First turn to the right and second to the left, and straight ahead till you see an avenue. If you meet the peasants, don't ask your way. They don't understand French, and they will pretend they did and mix you up. I'll be back for you here by sunset, and don't forget the tombs in the chapel." I followed Lanrivain's directions with a hesitation occasioned by the usual difficulty of remembering whether he had said the first turn to the right and second to the left, or the contrary. If I had met a peasant, I should certainly have asked, and probably been sent astray, but I had the desert landscape to myself, and so stumbled on the right turn and walked across the heath till I came to an avenue. It was so unlike any other avenue I have ever seen that I instantly knew it must be the avenue. The grey-trunked trees sprang up straight to a great height, and then interwove their pale grey branches in a long tunnel through which the autumn light fell faintly. I know most trees by name, but I haven't to this day been able to decide what those trees were. They had the tall curve of elms, the tenuity of poplars, the ashen colour of olives under a rainy sky, and they stretched ahead of me for half a mile or more without a break in their arch. If ever I saw an avenue that unmistakably led to something, it was the avenue at Careful. My heart beat a little as I began to walk down it. Presently the trees ended, and I came to a fortified gate and a long wall. Between me and the wall was an open space of grass, with other grey avenues radiating from it. Behind the wall were tall slate roofs mossed with silver, a chapel belfry, the top of a keep, a moat filled with wild shrubs and brambles surrounded the place. The drawbridge had been replaced by a stone arch, and the portcullis by an iron gate. I stood for a long time on the hither side of the moat, gazing about me and letting the influence of the place sink in. I said to myself, if I wait long enough, the guardian will turn up and show me the tombs, and I rather hoped he wouldn't turn up too soon. I sat down on a stone and lit a cigarette. As soon as I'd done it, it struck me as a puerile and portentous thing to do, with that great blind house looking down at me, and all the empty avenues converging on me. It may have been the depth of the silence that made me so conscious of my gesture. The squeak of my match sounded as loud as the scraping of a brake, and I almost fancied I heard it fall when I tossed it onto the grass. But there was more than that. A sense of irrelevance, of littleness, of futile bravado in sitting there puffing my cigarette smoke into the face of such a past. I knew nothing of the history of Careful. I was new to Brittany, and Larrivain had never mentioned the name to me till the day before, but one couldn't as much glance at the pile without feeling in it a long accumulation of history. What kind of history I was not prepared to guess. Perhaps only that sheer weight of many associated lives and deaths which gives a majesty to all old houses. But the aspect of Careful suggested something more. A perspective of stern and cruel memories stretching away like its own grey avenues into a blur of darkness. Certainly no house had ever more completely and finally broken with the present. As it stood there, lifting its proud roofs and gables to the sky, it might have been its own funeral monument. Tombs in the chapel! The whole place is a tomb, I reflected. I hoped more and more that the guardian wouldn't come. The details of the place, however striking, would seem trivial compared with its collective impressiveness. and I wanted only to sit there and be penetrated by the weight of its silence. "It's the very place for you," Larivin had said, and I was overcome by the almost blasphemous frivolity of suggesting to any living being that Carefol was the place for him. Is it possible that anyone could not see? I wondered. I didn't finish the thought. What I meant was undefinable. I stood up and wandered toward the gate. I was beginning to want to know more, not to see more. I was by now so sure it was not a question of seeing, but to feel more. Feel all the place had to communicate. But to get in, one will have to rout out the keeper, I thought reluctantly, and hesitated. Finally, I crossed the bridge and tried the iron gate. It yielded, and I walked through the tunnel formed by the thickness of the chemin de ronde. At the farther end, a wooden barricade had been laid across the entrance, and beyond it was a court enclosed in noble architecture. The main building faced me, and I now saw that one half was a mere ruined front with gaping windows through which the wild growths of the moat and the trees of the park were visible. The rest of the house was still in its robust beauty, one end abutted on the round tower, the other on the small tracery chapel, and in an angle of the building stood a graceful wellhead crowned with mossy urns. A few roses grew against the walls, and on an upper windowsill I remember noticing a pot of fuchsias. My sense of the pressure of the invisible began to yield to my architectural interest. The building was so fine that I felt a desire to explore it for its own sake. I looked about the court, wondering in which corner the guardian lodged. Then I pushed open the barrier and went in. As I did so, a dog barred my way. He was such a remarkable, beautiful little dog that for a moment he made me forget the splendid place he was defending. I was not sure of his breed at the time, but I have since learned that it was Chinese and that he was of a rare variety called the sleeve dog. He was very small and golden brown, with large brown eyes and a ruffled throat. He looked like a large tawny chrysanthemum. I said to myself, these little beasts always snap and scream, and somebody will be out in a minute. The little animal stood before me, forbidding, almost menacing. There was anger in his large brown eyes, but he made no sound. He came no nearer. Instead, as I advanced, he gradually fell back, and I noticed that another dog, a vague, rough, brindled thing, had limped up on a lame leg. There'll be a hubbub now, I thought, for at the same moment a third dog, a long-haired white mongrel, slipped out of a doorway and joined the others. All three stood looking at me with grave eyes, but not a sound came from them. As I advanced, they continued to fall back on muffled paws, still watching me. At a given point, they will charge at my ankles. It's one of the jokes that dogs who live together put up on one, I thought. I was not alarmed, for they were neither large nor formidable. But they let me wander about the court as I pleased, following me at a little distance, always the same distance, and always keeping their eyes on me. Presently I looked across the ruined facade and saw that in one of its empty window frames another dog stood, a white pointer with one brown ear. He was an old grave dog, much more experienced than the others, and he seemed to be observing me with a deeper intentness. I'll hear from him, I said to myself, but he stood in the window frame, against the trees of the park, and continued to watch me without moving. I stared back at him for a time to see if the sense that he was being watched would not rouse him. Half the width of the court lay between us, and we gazed at each other silently across it. But he didn't stir, and at last I turned away. Behind me I found the rest of the pack, with a newcomer added, a small black greyhound with pale agate-coloured eyes. He was shivering a little, and his expression was more timid than that of the others. I noticed that he kept a little behind them, and still there was not a sound. I stood there for fully 5 minutes, the circle about me, waiting, as they seemed to be waiting. At last I went up to the little golden brown dog and stooped to pat him. As I did so, I heard myself give a nervous laugh. The little dog did not start, or growl, or take his eyes from me. He simply slipped back about a yard, and then paused and continued to look at me. "Oh, hang it," I exclaimed, and walked across the court towards the well. As I advanced, the dogs separated and slid away into different corners of the court. I examined the urns on the well, tried a locked door or two, and looked up and down the dumb facade. Then I faced about toward the chapel. When I turned, I perceived that all the dogs had disappeared, except the old pointer, who still watched me from the window. It was rather a relief to be rid of that cloud of witnesses. I began to look about me for a way to the back of the house. Perhaps there'll be somebody in the garden, I thought. I found a way across the moat, scrambled over a wall smothered in brambles, and got into the garden. A few lean hydrangeas and geraniums pined in the flower beds, and the ancient house looked down on them indifferently. Its garden side was plainer and severer than the other. The long granite front, with its few windows and steep roof, looked like a fortress prison. I walked around the farther wing, went up some disjointed steps, and entered the deep twilight of a narrow and incredibly old box walk. The walk was just wide enough for one person to slip through, and its branches met overhead. It was like the ghost of a box walk, its lustrous green all turning to the shadowy greyness of the avenues. I walked on, with the branches hitting me in the face and springing back with a dry rattle, and at length I came out onto the grassy top of the chemin de ronde. I walked along it to the gate tower, looking down into the court which was just below me. Not a human being was in sight, and neither were the dogs. I found a flight of steps in the thickness of the wall and went down them, and when I emerged again into the court, there stood the circle of dogs, the golden brown one a little ahead of the others, the black greyhound shivering in the rear. "Oh, hang it, you uncomfortable beasts, you!" I exclaimed, my voice startling me with a sudden echo. The dogs stood motionless, watching me. I knew by this time that they would not try to prevent my approaching the house, and the knowledge left me free to examine them. I had a feeling that they must be horribly cowed to be so silent and inert. Yet they didn't look hungry or ill-treated. Their coats were smooth, and they were not thin, except the shivering greyhound. It was more as if they had lived a long time with people who never spoke to them or looked at them, as though the silence of the place had gradually benumbed their busy, inquisitive natures. And this strange passivity, this almost human lassitude, seemed to me sadder than the misery of starved and beaten animals. I should have liked to rouse them for a minute, to coax them into a game or a scamper, but the longer I looked into their fixed and weary eyes, the more preposterous the idea became. With the windows of that house looking down on us, how could I have imagined such a thing? The dogs knew better. They knew what the house would tolerate and what it would not. I even fancied they knew what was passing through my mind and pitied me for my frivolity. But even that feeling probably reached them through a thick fog of listlessness. I had an idea that their distance from me was as nothing to my remoteness from them. The impression they produced was that of having in common one memory so deep and dark that nothing that had happened since was worth either a growl or a wag. "I say," I broke out abruptly, addressing myself to the dumb circle, "do you know what you look like, the whole lot of you? You look as if you'd seen a ghost, that's how you look. I wonder if there is a ghost here, and nobody but you left for it to appear to." The dogs continued to gaze at me, without moving. It was dark when I saw Larry Vane's motor lamps at the crossroads, and I wasn't exactly sorry to see them. I had the sense of having escaped from the loneliest place in the whole world, and of not liking loneliness to that degree, as much as I had imagined I should. My friend had brought his solicitor back from Quimper for the night, and seated beside a fat and affable stranger, I felt no inclination to talk of Care Folle. But that evening, when Larivane and the solicitor were closeted in the study, Madame de Larivane began to question me in the drawing-room. "Well, are you going to buy Care Folle?" she asked, tilting up her gay chin from her embroidery. "I haven't decided yet. The fact is, I couldn't get into the house," I said, as if I had simply postponed my decision and meant to go back for another look. "You couldn't get in? Why, what's happened?" The family are mad to sell the place, and the old guardian has orders. Very likely, but the old guardian wasn't there. What a pity. He must have gone to market. But his daughter? There was nobody about. At least I saw no one. How extraordinary. Literally nobody. Nobody but a lot of dogs, a whole pack of them, who seemed to have the place to themselves. Madame de la Rivaine let the embroidery slip to her knee and folded her hands on it. For several minutes she looked at me, thoughtfully. A pack of dogs. You saw them? Saw them? I saw nothing else. How many? She dropped her voice a little. I've always wondered. I looked at her with surprise. I had supposed the place to be familiar to her. Have you never been to Kerfol? I asked. Oh, yes, often, but never on that day. What day? I had quite forgotten, and so had Hervé, I'm sure. If we'd remembered, we never should have sent you today. But then, after all, one doesn't half believe that sort of thing, does one? What sort of thing? I asked, involuntarily sinking my voice to the level of hers. Inwardly, I was thinking, I knew there was something. Madame de la Rivaine cleared her throat and produced a reassuring smile. Didn't Hervé tell you the story of Kerfol? An ancestor of his was mixed up in it. You know, every Breton house has a ghost story, and some of them are rather unpleasant. Yes, but those dogs? Well, those dogs are the ghosts of Kerfol. At least the peasants say there's one day in the year when a lot of dogs appear there, and that day the keeper and his daughter go to Morlaix and get drunk. The women in Brittany drink dreadfully. She stooped to match a silk, then she lifted her charming, inquisitive Parisian face. Did you really see a lot of dogs? There isn't one at Kerfol, she said. 2. La Rivaine the next day hunted out a shabby calf volume from the back of an upper shelf of his library. Yes, here it is. What does it call itself? A History of the Assizes of the Duchy of Brittany, Quimper, 1702. The book was written about 100 years later than the Kerfol affair, but I believe the account is transcribed pretty literally from the judicial records. Anyhow, it's queer reading. And there's a Hervé de la Rivaine mixed up in it. Not exactly my style, as you'll see, but then he's only a collateral. Here, take the book up to bed with you. I don't exactly remember the details, but after you've read it, I'll bet anything you'll leave your light burning all night. I left my light burning all night, as he had predicted, but it was chiefly because, till near dawn, I was absorbed in my reading. The account of the trial of Anne de Cornol, wife of the Lord of Kerfol, was long and closely printed. It was, as my friend had said, probably an almost literal transcription of what took place in the courtroom, and the trial lasted nearly a month. Besides, the type of the book was very bad. At first I thought of translating the old record, but it's full of wearisome repetitions, and the main lines of the story are forever straying off into side issues. So I've tried to disentangle it and give it here in a simpler form. At times, however, I have reverted to the text because no other words could have conveyed so exactly the sense of what I felt, Kerfol, and nowhere have I added anything of my own. 3. It was a year 16 that Yves de Cornol, lord of the domain of Kerfol, went to the Pardon of Locronan to perform his religious duties. He was a rich and powerful noble, then in his 62nd year, but hale and sturdy, a great horseman and hunter, and a pious man. So all his neighbours attested. In appearance he was short and broad, with a swarthy face, legs slightly bowed from the saddle, a hanging nose and broad hands with black hairs on them. He had married young and lost his wife and son soon after, and since then had lived alone at Kerfol. Twice a year he went to Morlaix, where he had a handsome house by the river and spent a week or 10 days there. And occasionally he rode to Rennes on business. Witnesses were found to declare that during these absences he led a life different from the one he was known to lead at Kerfol, where he busied himself with his estate, attended mass daily, and found his only amusement in hunting the wild boar and waterfowl. But these rumours are not particularly relevant, and it is certain that among people of his own class in the neighbourhood he passed for a stern and even austere man. observant of his religious obligations and keeping strictly to himself. There was no talk of any familiarity with the women on his estate, although at that time the nobility were very free with their peasants. Some people said he had never looked at a woman since his wife's death, but such things are hard to prove, and the evidence on this point was not worth much. Well, in his 62nd year, Yves de Corneau went to the Pardon at La Cronan and saw there a young lady of Douarnenez who had ridden over pillion behind her father to do her duty to the saint. Her name was Anne de Barrigan, and she came of good old Breton stock, but much less great and powerful than that of Yves de Corneau. And her father had squandered his fortune at cards and lived almost like a peasant in his little granite manor on the moors. I have said I would add nothing of my own to this bold statement of a strange case, but I must interrupt myself here to describe the young lady who rode up to the lich gate of Le Cronan, at the very moment when the Baron de Corneau was also dismounting there. I take my description from a faded drawing in red crayon, sober and truthful enough to be by a late pupil of the Clouet, which hangs in Larivin's study and is said to be a portrait of Anne de Barrigan. It is unsigned and has no mark of identity, but the initials A.B. and the date 16, the year after her marriage. It represents a young woman with a small oval face, almost pointed, yet wide enough for a full mouth with a tender depression at the corners. The nose is small, and the eyebrows are set rather high, far apart, and as lightly penciled as the eyebrows in a Chinese painting. The forehead is high and serious, and the hair, which one feels to be fine and thick and fair, is drawn off it and lies close, like a cap. The eyes are neither large nor small, hazel probably, with a look at once shy and steady. A pair of beautiful long hands are crossed below the lady's breast. The chaplain of Kerfol and other witnesses averred that when the Baron came back from Le Cronan, he jumped from his horse, ordered another to be instantly saddled, called to a young page to come with him, and rode away that same evening to the south. His steward followed the next morning with coffers laden on a pair of pack mules. The following week, Yves de Corneau rode back to Kerfol, sent for his vassals and tenants, and told them he was to be married at All Saints to Anne de Barrigan of Douarnenez, and on All Saints' Day the marriage took place. As to the next few years, the evidence on both sides seemed to show that they passed happily for the couple. No one was found to say that Yves de Corneau had been unkind to his wife, and it was plain to all that he was content with his bargain. Indeed, it was admitted by the chaplain and other witnesses for the prosecution that the young lady had a softening influence on her husband, and that he became less exacting with his tenants, less harsh to peasants and dependents, and less subject to the fits of gloomy silence which had darkened his widowhood. As to his wife, the only grievance her champions could call up in her behalf was that Kerfol was a lonely place, and that when her husband was away on business at Rennes or Morlaix, whither she was never taken, she was not allowed as much as to walk in the park unaccompanied. But no one asserted that she was unhappy, though one servant woman said she had surprised her crying, and had heard her say that she was a woman accursed to have no child and nothing in life to call her own. But that was a natural enough feeling in a wife attached to her husband, and certainly it must have been a great relief to Yves de Corneau that she bore no son. Yet he never made her feel her childlessness as a reproach. She admits this in her evidence, but seemed to try to make her forget it by showering gifts and favours on her. Rich though he was, he had never been open-handed, but nothing was too fine for his wife in the way of silks or gems or linen or whatever else she fancied. Every wandering merchant was welcome at Kerfol, and when the master was called away he never came back without bringing his wife a handsome present, something curious and particular, from Morlaix or Rennes or Quimper. One of the waiting women gave, in cross-examination, an interesting list of 1 year's gifts which I copy. From Morlaix, a carved ivory junk with Chinamen at the oars, that a strange sailor had brought back as a votive offering for Notre-Dame de la Clarté, above Ploumanach. From Quimper, an embroidered gown worked by the nuns for the Assumption. From Rennes, a silver rose that opened and showed an amber virgin with a crown of garnets, From Morlaix again, a length of Damascus velvet, shot with gold, bought of a Jew from Syria, and for Michaelmas, that same year, from Rennes, a necklet or bracelet of round stones, emeralds and pearls and rubies, strung like beads on a fine gold chain. This was the present that pleased the lady best, the woman said. Later on, as it happened, it was produced at the trial, and appears to have struck the judges and the public as a curious and valuable jewel. The very same winter, the Baron absented himself again, this time as far as Bordeaux, and on his return he brought his wife something even odder and prettier than the bracelet. It was a winter evening when he rode up to Kerfol, and walking into the hall found her sitting by the hearth, her chin on her hand, looking into the fire. He carried a velvet box in his hand, and setting it down, lifted the lid and let out a little golden-brown dog. Anne de Cornault exclaimed with pleasure as the little creature bounded toward her. "Oh, it looks like a bird or a butterfly," she cried as she picked it up, and the dog put its paws on her shoulders and looked at her with eyes like a Christian's. After that she would never have it out of her sight, and petted and talked to it as if it had been a child, as indeed it was the nearest thing to a child she was to know. Yves de Cornault was much pleased with his purchase. The dog had been brought to him by a sailor from an East India merchantman, and the sailor had bought it of a pilgrim in a bazaar in Jaffa, who had stolen it from a nobleman's wife in China, a perfectly permissible thing to do, since the pilgrim was a Christian and the nobleman a heathen doomed to hellfire. Yves de Cornault had paid a long price for the dog, for they were beginning to be in demand at the French court, and the sailor knew he had got hold of a good thing. But Anne's pleasure was so great that to see her laugh and play with the little animal, her husband would doubtless have given twice the sum. So far, all the evidence is at one and the narrative plain sailing, but now the steering becomes difficult. I will try to keep as nearly as possible to Anne's own statements, though toward the end, poor thing. Well, to go back. The very year after the little brown dog was brought to Kerfol, Yves de Cornault, one winter night, was found dead at the head of a narrow flight of stairs leading down from his wife's rooms to a door opening on the court. It was his wife who found him and gave the alarm, so distracted, poor wretch, with fear and horror, for his blood was all over her, that at first the roused household could not make out what she was saying, and thought she'd suddenly gone mad. But there, sure enough, at the top of the stairs lay her husband, stone dead, and head foremost, the blood from his wounds dripping down to the steps below him, getting dreadfully scratched and gashed about the face and throat, as if with curious pointed weapons, and one of his legs had a deep tear in it, which had cut an artery and probably caused his death. But how did he come there, and who had murdered him? His wife declared that she had been asleep in her bed, and hearing his cry had rushed out to find him lying on the stairs, but this was immediately questioned. In the first place, it was proved that from her room she could not have heard the struggle on the stairs, owing to the thickness of the walls and the length of the intervening passage. Then it was evident that she had not been in bed and asleep, since she was dressed when she roused the house, and her bed had not been slept in. Moreover, the door at the bottom of the stairs was ajar, and it was noticed by the chaplain, an observant man, that the dress she wore was stained with blood about the knees, and that there were traces of small blood-stained hands low down on the staircase walls, so that it was conjectured that she had really been at the postern door when her husband fell, and feeling her way up to him in the darkness on her hands and knees, had been stained by his blood dripping down on her. Of course, it was argued on the other side that the blood marks on her dress might have been caused by her kneeling down by her husband when she rushed out of her room, but there was the open door below, and the fact that the finger marks in the staircase all pointed upward. The accused held to her statement for the first 2 days in spite of its improbability, but on the third day word was brought to her that Hervé de Larrivain, a young nobleman of the neighbourhood, had been arrested for complicity in the crime. 2 or 3 witnesses thereupon came forward to say that it was known throughout the country that Larrivain had formerly been on good terms with the Lady of Cornault, but that he had been absent from Brittany for over a year, and people had ceased to associate their names. The witnesses who made this statement were not of a very reputable sort. One was an old herb gatherer suspected of witchcraft, another a drunken clerk from a neighbouring parish, the third a half-witted shepherd who could be made to say anything. And it was clear that the prosecution was not satisfied with its case and would have liked to find more definite proof of Larrivin's complicity than the statement of the herb gatherer, who swore to having seen him climbing the wall of the park on the night of the murder. One way of patching out incomplete proofs in those days was to put some sort of pressure, moral or physical, on the accused person. It is not clear what pressure was put on Anne de Corneau, but on the third day, when she was brought in court, she appeared weak and wandering. And after being encouraged to collect herself and speak the truth on her honour and the wounds of her blessed Redeemer, she confessed that she had in fact gone down the stairs to speak with Hervé de Larrivin, who denied everything, and had been surprised there by the sound of her husband's fall. That was better, and the prosecution rubbed its hands with satisfaction. The satisfaction increased when various dependents living at Kerfol were induced to say with apparent sincerity that during the year or two preceding his death, their master had once more grown uncertain and irascible, and subject to the fits of brooding silence which his household had learned to dread before his second marriage. This seemed to show that things had not been going well at Kerfol, though no one could be found to say that there had been any signs of open disagreement between husband and wife. Anne de Corneau, when questioned as to her reason for going down at night to open the door to Hervé de Larrivin, made an answer which must have sent a smile round the court. She said it was because she was lonely and wanted to talk with the young man. Was this the only reason? She was asked in reply. Yes, by the cross over your lordship's heads. But why at midnight? The court asked. Because I could see him in no other way. I can see the exchange of glances across the ermine collars under the crucifix. Anne de Corneau, further questioned, said that her married life had been extremely lonely, desolate was the word she used. It was true that her husband seldom spoke harshly to her, but there were days when he didn't speak at all. It was true that he had never struck or threatened her, but he kept her like a prisoner at Kerfol, and when he rode away to Morlaix or Quimper or Rennes, he set so close a watch on her that she couldn't pick a flower in the garden without having a waiting woman at her heels. I am no queen to need such honours, she once said to him, and he had answered that the man who has a treasure does not leave the key in the lock when he goes out. Then take me with you, she urged. But to this he said that towns were pernicious places and young wives better off at their own firesides. But what did you want to say to Hervé de Larrivin, the court asked, and she answered, to ask him to take me away. Ah, you confess that you went down to him with adulterous thoughts? No. Then why did you want him to take you away? Because I was afraid for my life. Of whom were you afraid? Of my husband. Why were you afraid of your husband? Because he had strangled my little dog. Another smile must have passed around the courtroom in days when any nobleman had the right to hang his peasants, and most of them exercised it. Pinching a pet animal's windpipe was nothing to make a fuss about. At this point, one of the judges, who appears to have had a certain sympathy for the accused, suggested that she should be allowed to explain herself in her own way, and she thereupon made the following statement. The first years of her marriage had been lonely, but her husband had not been unkind to her. If she had had a child, she would not have been unhappy, but the days were long and it rained too much. It was true that her husband, whenever he went away and left her, brought her a handsome present on his return, but this did not make up for the loneliness. At least nothing had, till he brought her the little brown dog from the east. After that, she was much less unhappy. Her husband seemed pleased that she was so fond of the dog. He gave her leave to put her jewelled bracelet around its neck and to keep it always with her. One day she had fallen asleep in her room with the dog at her feet, as his habit was. Her feet were bare and resting on his back. Suddenly she was waked by her husband. He stood beside her, smiling not unkindly. You look like my great-grandmother, Juliane de Corneau, lying in the chapel with her feet on the little dog, he said. The analogy sent a chill through her, but she laughed and answered. Well, when I'm dead, you must put me beside her, carved in marble, with my dog at my feet. Oh, we'll wait and see, he said, laughing also, but with his black brows close together. The dog is the emblem of fidelity. And do you doubt my right to lie with mine at my feet? When I'm in doubt, I find out, he answered. I'm an old man, he added, and people say I make you lead a lonely night. But I swear you shall have your monument, if you earn it. And I swear to be faithful, she returned, if only for the sake of having my little dog at my feet. Not long afterward, he went on business to the compare sizes, and while he was away, his aunt, the widow of a great nobleman of the duchy, came to spend the night at Carefog, on her way to the pardon of Sainte-Barbe. She was a woman of piety and consequence, and much respected by Yves de Cornault. But when she proposed to Anne to go with her to Sainte-Barbe, no one could object, and even the chaplain declared himself in favour of the pilgrimage. So Anne set out for Sainte-Barbe, and there, for the first time, she talked with Hervé de Larrivain. He'd come once or twice to Carefol with his father, but she'd never before exchanged a dozen words with him. They didn't talk for more than 5 minutes now. It was under the chestnuts, as the procession was coming out of the chapel. He said, I pity you, and she was surprised, for she had not supposed that anyone thought her an object of pity. He added, call for me when you need me, and she smiled a little, but was glad afterward, and thought often of the meeting. She confessed to having seen him 3 times afterward, not more. How or where she wouldn't say. One had the impression that she feared to implicate someone. Their meetings had been rare and brief, and at the last he had told her that he was starting the next day for a foreign country on a mission which was not without peril and might keep him for many months absent. He asked her for a remembrance, and she had none to give him but the collar about the little dog's neck. She was sorry afterward that she'd given it, but he was so unhappy at going that she had not the courage to refuse. Her husband was away at the time. When he returned a few days later, he picked up the animal to pet it and noticed that its collar was missing. His wife told him that the dog had lost it in the undergrowth of the park, and that she and her maids had hunted a whole day for it. It was true, she explained to the court, that she had made the maids search for the necklace. They all believed the dog had lost it in the park. Her husband made no comment, and that evening at supper he was in his usual mood, between good and bad, you could never tell which. He talked a good deal, describing what he'd seen and done in Rennes, but now and then he stopped and looked hard at her. And when she went to bed, she found a little dog strangled on a pillow. The little thing was dead, but still warm. She stooped to lift it, and her distress turned to horror when she discovered that it had been strangled by twisting twice round its throat the necklet she had given to Larrivain. The next morning at dawn she buried the dog in the garden and hid the necklet in her breast. She said nothing to her husband then or later, and he said nothing to her, but that day he had a peasant hanged for stealing a faggot in the park, and the next day he nearly beat to death a young horse he was breaking. Winter set in, and the short days passed, and the long nights one by one, and she heard nothing of Hervé de Larrivain. It might be that her husband had killed him, or merely that he had been robbed of the necklet. Day after day, by the hearth, among the spinning maids, night after night, alone on her bed, she wondered and trembled. Sometimes at table her husband looked across at her and smiled, and then she felt sure that Larrivain was dead. She dared not try to get news of him, for she was sure her husband would find out if she did. She had an idea that he could find out anything. Even when a witch woman who was a noted seer and could show you the whole world in her crystal came to the castle for a night's shelter, and the maids flocked to her, Anne held back. The winter was long and black and rainy. One day, in Yves de Cornault's absence, some gypsies came to Carefol with a troop of performing dogs. Anne bought the smallest and cleverest, the white dog with a feathery coat and one blue and one brown eye. It seemed to have been ill-treated by the gypsies and clung to her plaintively when she took it from them. That evening, her husband came back, and when she went to bed, she found the dog strangled on her pillow. After that, she said to herself that she would never have another dog. But one bitter cold evening, a poor lean greyhound was found whining at the castle gate, and she took him in and forbade the maids to speak of him to her husband. She hid him in a room that no one went to and smuggled food to him from her own plate, made him a warm bed to lie on, and petted him like a child. Yves de Cornault came home, and the next day she found the greyhound strangled on her pillow. She wept in secret, but said nothing, and resolved that even if she met a dog dying of hunger, she would never bring him into the castle. But one day she found a young sheepdog, a brindled puppy with good blue eyes, lying with a broken leg in the snow of the park. Yves de Cornault was at Rennes, and she brought the dog in, warmed and fed it, tied up its leg and hid it in the castle till her husband returned. The day before, she gave it to a peasant woman who lived a long way off and paid her handsomely to care for it and say nothing. But that night, she heard a whining and scratching at her door, and when she opened it, the lame puppy, drenched and shivering, jumped up on her with little sobbing barks. She hid him in her bed, and the next morning was about to have him taken back to the peasant woman, when she heard her husband ride into the court. She shut the dog in a chest and went down to receive him. An hour or two later, when she returned to her room, the puppy lay strangled on her pillow. After that, she dared not make a pet of any other dog, and her loneliness became almost unendurable. Sometimes when she crossed the court of the castle and thought no one was looking, she stopped to pat the old pointer at the gate. One day she was caressing him, her husband came out of the chapel, and the next day the old dog was gone. This curious narrative was not told in one sitting of the court, or received without impatience and incredulous comment. It was plain that the judges were surprised by its puerility, and that it didn't help the accused in the eyes of the public. It was an odd tale, certainly, but what did it prove? That Yves de Cornault disliked dogs, and that his wife, to gratify her own fancy, persistently ignored this dislike. As for pleading this trivial disagreement as an excuse for her relations, whatever their nature, with her supposed accomplice, the argument was so absurd that her own lawyer manifestly regretted having let her make use of it, and tried several times to cut short her story. But she went on to the end, with a kind of hypnotized insistence, as though the scenes she evoked were so real to her that she had forgotten where she was and imagined herself to be reliving them. At length, the judge, who had previously shown a certain kindness to her, said, leaning forward a little, one may suppose, from his row of dozing colleagues, "Then you would have us believe that you murdered your husband because he would not let you keep a pet dog." "I did not murder my husband." "Who did then? Hervé de Lanrivain?" "No." "Who then? Can you tell us?" "Yes, I can tell you. The dogs." At that point she was carried out of the court in a swoon. It was evident that her lawyer tried to get her to abandon this line of defence. Possibly her explanation, whatever it was, had seemed convincing when she poured it out to him in the heat of their first private colloquy, but now that she was exposed to the cold daylight of judicial scrutiny and the banter of the town, he was thoroughly ashamed of it, and would have sacrificed her without a scruple to save his professional reputation. But the obstinate judge, who, perhaps after all, was more inquisitive than kindly, evidently wanted to hear the story out, and she was ordered the next day to continue her deposition. She said that after the disappearance of the old watchdog, nothing particular happened for a month or two. Her husband was much as usual. She didn't remember any special incident. But one evening a peddler woman came to the castle and was selling trinkets to the maids. She had no heart for trinkets, but she stood looking on while the women made their choice, and then, she didn't know how, but the peddler coaxed her into buying for herself a pear-shaped pomander with a strong scent in it. She had once seen something of the kind on a gypsy woman. She had no desire for the pomander and didn't know why she'd bought it. The peddler said that whoever wore it had the power to read the future, but she didn't really believe that, or care much either. However, She bought the thing and took it up to her room, where she sat, turning it about in her hand. Then the strange scent attracted her, and she began to wonder what kind of spice was in the box. She opened it and found a grey bean rolled in a strip of paper, and on the paper she saw a sign she knew, and a message from Hervé de Narivin, saying that he was at home again and would be at the door in the court that night after the moon had set. She burned the paper and sat down to think. It was nightfall, and her husband was at home. She had no way of warning Narivin, and there was nothing to do but wait. At this point I fancy the drowsy courtroom beginning to wake up. Even to the oldest hand on the bench there must have been a certain relish in picturing the feelings of a woman on receiving such a message at nightfall from a man living 20 miles away, to whom she had no means of sending a warning. She was not a clever woman, I imagine, and as the first result of her cogitation she appears to have made the mistake of being, that evening, too kind to her husband. She couldn't ply him with wine according to the traditional expedient, for though he drank heavily at times, he had a strong head, and when he drank beyond its strength it was because he chose to, and not because a woman coaxed him, not his wife at any rate. She was an old story by now. As I read the case, I fancy there was no feeling for her left in him but the hatred occasioned by his supposed dishonour. At any rate, she tried to call up her old graces, but early in the evening he complained of pains and fever and left the hall to go up to the closet where he sometimes slept. His servant carried him a cup of hot wine and brought back word that he was sleeping and not to be disturbed. And an hour later, when Anne lifted the tapestry and listened at his door, she heard his loud, regular breathing. She thought it might be a faint and stayed a long time barefooted in the passage, her ear to the crack, but the breathing went on too steadily and naturally to be other than that of a man in a sound sleep. She crept back to her room reassured and stood in the window, watching the moon set through the trees of the park. The sky was misty and starless, and after the moon went down the night was as black as pitch. She knew the time had come and stole along the passage, past her husband's door, where she stopped again to listen to his breathing, to the top of the stairs. There she paused a moment and assured herself that no one was following her. Then she began to go down the stairs into the darkness. They were so steep and winding that she had to go very slowly for fear of stumbling. Her one thought was to get the door unbolted, tell Larivin to make his escape, and hasten back to her room. She had tried the bolt earlier in the evening and managed to put a little grease on it, but nevertheless when she drew it, it gave a squeak, not loud, but it made her heart stop, and the next minute overhead she heard a noise. "What noise?" the prosecution interposed. "My husband's voice, calling out my name and cursing me." "What did you hear after that?" "A terrible scream and a fall." "Where was Hervé de Narivin at this time?" "He was standing outside in the court. I just made him out in the darkness. I told him for God's sake to go, and then I pushed the door shut." "What did you do next?" "I stood at the foot of the stairs and listened." "What did you hear?" "I heard dogs, snarling and panting, visible discouragement of the bench, boredom of the public, and exasperation of the lawyer for the defence. Dogs again. But the inquisitive judge insisted." "What dogs?" She bent her head and spoke so low that she had to be told to repeat her answer. "I don't know." "How do you mean you don't know?" "I don't know what dogs." The judge again intervened. "Try to tell us exactly what happened. How long did you remain at the foot of the stairs?" "Only a few minutes." "And what was going on meanwhile, overhead?" "The dogs kept on snarling and panting. Once or twice he cried out. I think he moaned once. Then he was quiet." "Then what happened?" "Then I heard a sound like the noise of a pack when the wolf is thrown to them, gulping and lapping." There was a groan of disgust and repulsion through the court, and another attempted intervention by the distracted lawyer, but the inquisitive judge was still inquisitive. "And all the while you did not go up?" "Yes, I went up then to drive them off." "The dogs?" "Yes." "Well?" When I got there, it was quite dark. I found my husband's flint and steel and struck a spark. I saw him lying there. He was dead. And the dogs? The dogs were gone. Gone! Where to? I don't know. There was no way out, and there are no dogs at Kerfol. She straightened herself to her full height, threw her arms above her head, and fell down on the stone floor with a long scream. There was a moment of confusion in the courtroom. Someone on the bench was heard to say, "This is clearly a case for the ecclesiastical authorities." And the prisoner's lawyer doubtless jumped at the suggestion. After this, the trial loses itself in a maze of cross-questioning and squabbling. Every witness who was called corroborated Andecono's statement that there were no dogs at Kerfol, and had been none for several months. The master of the house had taken quite a dislike to dogs. There was no denying it. But on the other hand, at the inquest, there had been a long and bitter discussion as to the nature of the dead man's wounds. One of the surgeons called in had spoken of marks that looked like bites. The suggestion of witchcraft was revived, and the opposing lawyers held tomes of necromancy at each other. At last, Andecono was brought back into court at the instance of the same judge, and asked if she knew where the dog she spoke of could have come from. On the body of her redeemer, she swore that she did not. Then the judge put his final question. If the dogs you think you heard had been known to you, do you think you would have recognized them by their barking? Yes. Did you recognize them? Yes. What dogs do you take them to have been? My dead dogs, she said in a whisper. She was taken out of court, not to reappear there again. There was some kind of ecclesiastical investigation, and the end of the business was that the judges disagreed with each other and with the ecclesiastical committee, and that Andecono was finally handed over to the keeping of her husband's family, who shut her up in the keep at Kerfol, where she is said to have died many years later, a harmless madwoman. So ends the story. As for that of Hervé de Narivin, I had only to apply to his collateral descendant for its subsequent details. The evidence against the young man being insufficient and his family influence in the duchy considerable, he was set free and left soon afterwards for Paris. He was probably in no mood for a worldly life, and he appears to have come almost immediately under the influence of the famous Monsieur Arnaud d'Andy and the gentlemen of Port-Royal. A year or two later, he was received into their order, and without achieving any particular distinction, he followed its good and evil fortunes till his death some 20 years later. Narivin showed me a portrait of him by a pupil of Philippe de Champagne. Sad eyes, an impulsive mouth, and a narrow brow. Poor Hervé de Narivin. It was a grey ending. Yet, as I looked at his stiff and sallow effigy, in the dark dress of the Jansenists, I almost found myself envying his fate. After all, in the course of his life, two great things had happened to him. He had loved romantically, and he must have talked with Pascal. So that was Kerfol by Edith Wharton, published in 1916 while the First World War was raging on in France. She lived in France a lot. Now, at that time, yeah. Now, a couple of things to say, mainly to preempt comments that will vex me. And I know from experience that the people who make these comments don't actually listen to this bit. So, but anyway, in the futility of it all, I'm still going to say, Edith Wharton was a dog lover. She had dogs all the time, so no dogs were injured during this story because it's a piece of fiction, and I know people will comment on this, but she loved dogs. And I remember writing a story where a dog died, and somebody wrote, Tony Walker's obviously hates dogs. Oh, absolutely untrue. My life is dogs. My life is dogs, like Edith Wharton's was. Now, one must reflect that the purpose of dogs in ghost and horror stories seem only to die. At least they came back as ghosts. Whereas the purpose of cats, as I've talked about elsewhere in the Chippendale Mirror, by E.F. Benson, that cats don't fare as badly in horror stories as dogs do. Dogs have a bad time in horror and ghost stories. So the first thing is that. The second thing is a faggot. A faggot is a small stick typically used for firewood. So hence the British slang, a fag for a cigarette, is a shortening of a faggot, a burning stick, because somebody will comment on that word as well. And the third thing is my use of R in careful, careful, careful. So a French uvula R, a tapped R, or a rhotic British English, non-rhotic British English. So I didn't say careful, I don't think. Curfall, I didn't do that either. So what is my justification? Well, I quite like the French language, but my heart goes to the Breton. So I'm learning Cornish at the moment. I've done a bit of Breton in the past. I'm going to learn Breton properly afterwards. So I am inclining to the Breton. Now, the older R in Breton was a tap, and you can still hear it if you go on the internet and you listen to some of the older Breton speakers. And in different dialects it's still prevalent, but of course with the younger people it's become more the French R. So careful. So I varied between that. Now, after those 3 points about faggots, dogs and R's, I'm going to tell you about Edith Wharton. So in the 6 years that I've been doing this now into our 6th calendar year anyway, we've done a few Edith Wharton stories, and one of the things that strikes me about Edith, if I may, is that her voice is so different in all the stories. I mean, you think of Mr. Jones, think of The Pomegranate Seed, Bewitched, The House of the Dead Hand. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're all really different, and this is also an Afterward, and this is similar. This feels a bit more like Afterward. Anyway, let me say something about her life. We've done a bit about her. My point being, I'm going to tell you again about her. So if you know, just hum to yourself or something. So anyway, she was born in 1862. Edith Newbold Wharton, born Edith Jones, in New York City, and the family was very, very wealthy. And it's them, if you didn't know, that gave rise to the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses." Those were the Joneses. You had to keep up. So the upper class New York society. Her family didn't really want her to write, but she was. I think if you write, you write. You can't help it. She published her first book of poetry at the age of 16, and then in her late 30s she began writing in earnest, particularly critiquing and portraying the Gilded Age people of the American Northeast, the wealthy. And she was a big pal of Henry James. We did a Henry James last week. We did the Jolly Corner. And in terms of writing, James has a lot to be said for him. But in terms of actually the writing and the pleasure of narrating it, I'd narrate 100 Edith Wharton stories for every one of Henry James's. I think I really like her writing. So famous for Ethan Frome. If he was from Somerset, they call him Ethan Froome. The 1911, The Age of Innocence, The House of Mirth. So a lot of these are critiques of the top draw people. She spent a lot of time in England, which is why a number of her stories like Mr. Jones and Afterward are actually set in England. And this one's set in France, or technically in Brittany. We could have a political argument about that. But I don't propose that we do. So, and she lived a long time in France as well, particularly during the First World War. So while she wrote this, she was living in France when this was written, I think. And she did a lot of work for the French war effort. She stayed in Paris doing humanitarian stuff, establishing workrooms for unemployed seamstresses, convalescent homes for tuberculosis patients, and schools for Belgian refugee children. Remember, Belgium being invaded by the Germans, and so they fled. Her dedication to the war effort earned her the French Legion of Honour, which she was given in 1916, the year that this story was published. Despite all that, and her genius as a writer, and her success as a writer, and her wealth, she had troubles, and her great humanitarian work, she had troubles. She was married to Edith Teddy Wharton, and he was a trust fund baby, like lots of them, like Henry James writes about, and she was an aesthete and an intellectual and a humanitarian. And I think he wasn't any of those things. And he spent most of her money. He was financially irresponsible. In 1911, he told her he'd spent most of her money. He suffered from acute depression and may have had bipolar disorder. You know, these psychiatric diagnoses are so flexible. There are no tests for them. They're just clinical opinions. So whatever mental health and emotional problems you have may vary according to which doctor you spoke to, or even be self-diagnosed. It was very hard to pin it down. So did he have bipolar? Who knows? He could have had what we would call a personality disorder. And that changes as well. And, you know, personality disorders still exist, but increasingly being called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So the name's changed, the nomenclature changes, the opinions of what you've got, and as long as there's no blood test or imaging test for them, who knows? Anyway, he was emotionally and mentally unstable, financially ruined her. Well, he didn't. He spent a lot of her money. She had a lot of money, but he spent a lot of it. He was also unfaithful, and she seemed such a nice lady. So he just wanted to play sports and outdoors, and she was an intellectual. So they were totally mismatched, really. By the end of their marriage, she was with him for 28 years, but by the end of that, somebody described him, I haven't got an origin of the quote here, as completely mentally unhinged. Afterwards, he moved back to the US, to Lennox, that's how you'd say it, it was in Scotland, and she moved permanently to France. She wrote about a book a year for the rest of her life. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1996. She was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate from Yale University. Her work continues to be celebrated, rightly so, I think. She passed away in August 37, 1930s in Saint-Paul-sous-Forêt near Paris, leaving behind a legacy as one of the major American novelists and short story writers of the 20th century. And I think that's right, you know. So I'm very fond of Edith Wharton. I didn't know her personally, but I think I would have been. It's worth saying that she was a big dog lover. And of course there are no human ghosts in this story, only the ghosts of dogs in this story, Careful. So she wrote in a diary entry, I am secretly afraid of animals, of all animals except dogs, and even of some dogs. I think it is because of the usness in their eyes, with the underlying not-usness which belies it, and is so tragic a reminder of the lost age when we human beings branched off and left them to eternal inarticulateness and slavery. Why, their eyes seem to ask us. I'm not sure I would agree with her on that, but certainly she loved dogs all her life, with many of them buried in a pet cemetery at her home, and was a charter member of the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And when her last dog, Linky, died, Wharton passed away 4 months after. Careful, yeah, it has cruelty to dogs in it. And actually, it makes me ponder on what this Classic Ghost Stories channel is about, because we cover it's called Classic Ghost Stories channel, and apart from my own stories, we cover a wide range of authors in times, from, you know, probably the earliest one is Etienne Hoffmann's stuff, maybe there's some earlier, late 18th century stories I've done, right up to sort of mid-20th century authors, and they vary in tone from cosy ghost stories, humorous ghost stories, to quite horrific stories in some cases. And what I would say is that this type of literature, stories, is intended, it's dark. It is dark, you know. If we wanted to do a comic stories channel, we wouldn't expect it to be dark at all, would we? If you come to a ghost stroke horror, we're going to be dipping our toes in darkness, and so I think you need to expect that and not be too. If this is stuff that you can't stomach, I mean, these stories are cruel to people, they're cruel to other animals, they're cruel to all sorts of people, they're cruel to children, you know, they're cruel to old people. this is their nature. This is darkness. This is what we're wading through a little bit, even if it is cozy. And the funny thing about the channel is that people use it to go to sleep, and they do find these stories cozy. And I would, I mean, even I notice a difference between, say, 80s slasher gore, where it's all about dismemberment and vileness, and particularly the later horror stories, which I don't do, which have sexual vileness in as well. And that is not to my taste. So I don't know what I'm saying there, really. I'm saying, I'm not going to put a trigger warning. That's what I'm saying. I'm not going to put a trigger warning that these stories contain dark things, because that is the nature of the channel. If you eat a piece of dark chocolate, you know it's going to taste like dark chocolate. If you don't like dark chocolate, don't pick it up. Yeah, and so that's as far as the trigger warning goes. The trigger warning is in the title, classic ghost stories, and then you look at it and you see it's about ghosts, monsters, horror. It's dark. So don't be affronted when it is dark, because that's what it is, and you should know that. Anyway, rant over. Let's look at the structure. So it is a frame story, and this is really common in this period. Think of The Turn of the Screw, classic example of its period. It starts by somebody recounting the story, so we have a modern bit, and that frames it. It is slightly unusual in that with a frame story, very often the person begins by recounting something that has happened to them or somebody else, and that is at one remove. So they are talking about something that's happened in the past and is no longer, and they're not involved in it. Whereas this frame, if frame it is a kind of frame, is the person themselves. He goes and see Kev fall, and at the end there's the tiniest touch of a frame just to seal it up, I think. Whereas most frame stories have usually a balanced beginning and an end, which the introduction, then the story itself, then the second part of the frame is a wrapping up. In some senses, yeah. So it was really common for ghost stories to be in that structure. The difference is that this sort of isn't quite a true frame, because the protagonist gets involved. It's clearly a story with strong gothic elements. So if we think about the gothic elements we find here are revenge, family problems, the very 18th century. Certainly the historical document feels like something going back to the 1790s or even early 1760s. The kind of thing that they were writing then about revenge and family problems. I've said all this, but you know what I'm saying. In this very gothic, it rains all the time, and it is completely gothic. We have the building itself, very classically gothic. So after saying that, I'm not labouring it. The first part, I think, is very simple. So we have this person who we don't really know, but is a bit of a loner, and so the person called Hervé Larivin, he's the same name as the guy in the story, interestingly. He's ancestor of some kind. He says, and he just drops this person on the heath, moor, and they walk alone to this gothic ruin, this half ruin. And it seems to me that Wharton succeeds extremely well in the creation of the atmosphere of just walking up to it, almost like a cinematic long shot. The establishing shots you get at the very beginning of some films, whereby we see, particularly in Gothic films, often you'll have Castle Dracula or Frankenstein's Laboratory, and we'll see it. I think also Nosferatu, the 2024 Eggers Nosferatu film, did this as well. So we see the castle as an establishing shot, and in fact the port of Visburg, isn't it, in Nosferatu, and it is just very cinematic almost. Except in this we have the benefit of the emotions and the impressions of the observer. So that's where it is kind of different to a camera, and more intimate, I think, because we're involved in it through the protagonist. So, but I think all we're doing is we are approaching over the moor, down the avenue, looking at it, spending some time looking at it from the outside, eventually going in through the door. There's nobody there, and that's very gothic. That was almost like there's a castle like that in Lady of the House of Love by Angela Carter. The Gothic, that's how you approach the Gothic castle. And and in Dracula, in all the various versions of Dracula, particularly the 23 version Nosferatu, he approaches the castle, which appears to be empty, coming to the Gothic building, which appears to be empty, and having to find your own way in it. I mean, we could be very psychoanalytical about that and say, what does that represent? Is it we are born into this world, into a Gothic castle, we don't know what on earth's going on here, we're a bit worried about it, we're amazed by it as well, and we've got to find our own way around it and negotiate whatever unknown mysteries it holds. We could say that. Or not. And that's that. And then the dogs, of course. And the dogs are like silent witnesses, and of course they are ghost dogs. We don't know that yet. But they are corporeal dogs. They're not spooky dogs that go through walls and wearing sheets. Funny enough, Callie came to see me the other day. She was wearing a blanket. I said to Sheila, did you put that blanket on her? And no, she put the blanket on herself and was wandering around wearing a blanket. But anyway, fell off, obviously. I just ate a golf ball when I came in. I've been to the gym, I came back, and there was a golf ball that they'd eaten. Anyway, they're naughty. Dogs. So the dogs are there, and she really did love dogs. Edith Wharton. They were great with her husband. So that's very interesting as well, isn't it? Because whereas we don't know. I mean, we know that her husband Teddy was a spendthrift and an adulterer, and they're probably hard to live with. What's the parallel between this and the young Anne de Brannigan? Is she Anne? Yeah. And Yves de Corneau. So, yeah, he's moody. He's controlling. There's no sense. I don't know enough about. I haven't read a biography of Edith Wharton. It's one thing I must do. Whether Teddy was controlling or just kind of crap. But you can see that, and lonely, and finding solace in the companion of her dog. Anne is a bit foolish, and as Edith Wharton says, Anne was not clever. Why would you give as a keepsake? I mean, and also the story, her story's a bit mixed up, because first of all, why did you go and answer the door? Well, I was lonely, and she knew it was him, and I just wanted to chat. And then I wanted him to take me away, and then later on she says she goes down with the express intention of warning him, telling him to git, but so that isn't consistent. But I think that works because I think Wharton's aware of that. I don't think that's an error on the part of the author. I think Wharton is portraying a woman whose story is shifting, because she knows the truth is going to be unpalatable. She actually swoons when she tells it, unpalatable to these people whose life, her death is in their hands, her life is in their hands, and she's going to have to tell them what she knows to be the truth, that those dogs killed her husband, which I believe actually, because of the wounds on his body. I think that there is some view that there's an ambiguity about this, that it's like playing, is she crazy? That old chestnut. Is she crazy? Is it really supernatural, or what is it, Scooby-Doo? But I don't think there is much wiggle room there. I think this is clearly supernatural. I mean, it's presented to us with the weird dogs. Let's say something about, very briefly, we can jump back to what else I was saying about how she conjures the supernatural. In this, she is a bit like Henry James. They're not full-on ghosts and monsters. It's just intimations of oddness. Like, what are these dogs doing? And that pointer that's just looking at her out the window. I tell you, a lovely little touch with the pot of fuchsias. Just this lovely detail she's got. That's nothing to do with the weirdness, but it's just this how she conjures the scene for you. That the Greeks called that, or the rhetoricians call it enargia or enargia, whereby you conjure a scene for the reader. And therefore you place the reader in the scene, experiencing it all if you do it well, and therefore they have the emotions. That's what you want to do with a story. You want to generate emotions in the reader, listener, as if they were there. And the pot of fuchsias I mean, if you're ever going to write something, just don't overdo it, but just the odd little detail whereby you go into a certain cup or a certain pair of shoes or a certain cloud, and that, just that one detailed piece plonks somebody in it. It's about focus. I was listening to a YouTube thing about focus, filter theory, whereby, the world, we live in the world, but we're only ever really aware of what we're focusing on. The rest of it might as well not exist. So this is an experiment now. Think about what you're focusing on. It could be me, it could be something else. Where's your foot? When was the last time you were aware of your feet? Now, if you've got chronic pain in your feet, you maybe were. But in that case, I'd say to you, what about your watch? I'm not going to say, well, if you don't have a watch. But you see what I'm saying, filter theory. So this Enargia theory is the pot of fuchsias. You're there. Another thing is to say, people talk about blackbirds. Before you actually look, they're just all blackbirds. And then when you kind of get into them, certainly in the UK, in similar places geographically, you have jackdaws, rooks, carrion crows, actual blackbirds, ravens, and they're all different. Starlings are blackish, and so, but if you don't look, you only see, you don't know. But when you focus, and it's something about human attention that's really special, and if you're writing and if you actually give somebody a focus, it becomes real, and therefore they are in that scene. As a writer, you place them in the scene. I've gone on about this, so it never get too long, but she does this really well. She was top notch, in my view. I really like her. I really like Edith Wharton, if you hadn't realised. So the first part is going up. The second part is like very gothic, as I said. It's very gothic in theme. It's a courtroom drama, isn't it? And of course, courtroom dramas were coming in detective fiction. I've said this about, and you have to listen to some of the stuff. Oh yeah, I did a Rumpole story, a Rumpole of the Bailey story, which is a courtroom drama. And, as a subgenre of detective fiction, courtroom dramas were coming in at this period. So we have a courtroom drama. It reminded me of M.R. James's story, Martin's Close. Now, Martin's Close came out 5 years before this one. So Martin's Close also has a two-part structure, a frame set in the present, his present, and a historical recounting which happens to take place in a courtroom. So they use the modern perspective, both stories, to create an atmosphere of intrigue and foreboding, then delve into a detailed historical explanation that provides context for the supernatural events. So in Martin's Close and in this one, Careful, the courtroom explains the ghost, although we didn't know there were ghost dogs. Well, we didn't know. We didn't know until our protagonist goes back and Madame de Larivin says, "Oh, the dogs, you saw the dogs." And then we're like, what? I just thought they were dogs. No. And then we get the penny drops, they are ghost dogs. And then the next part, the historical part, explains why they are. So let's say something else about. So that's the structure, and I think it's similar to M.R. James's Martin's Close, came out 5 years earlier. It has elements of the courtroom drama. I think the way she does that back and forward of the cross-examination is really good. I enjoyed narrating that, actually. We talked about the gothic nature of Careful. Some other themes, so isolation and loneliness. Anne de Corneau trapped in an oppressive and loveless marriage by a really controlling man. Careful itself with sombre architecture and eerie silence mirrors Anne's internal desolation. Now, interestingly, there was a French philosopher called Gaston Bachelard, and he wrote a book called The Poetics of Space, published in 1958. So this is not, I'm not saying that Careful is influenced by this, but it's interesting that they're both French or Breton. He wasn't Breton, I don't think. So Bachelard's his basic idea is that the house and other spaces we inhabit, but particularly houses, they can be understood as frameworks for understanding them as a model of the psyche, with rooms and levels as layers of consciousness, corners, nooks and crannies, the house as memory. And of course, we see Careful, and he actually distinctly alludes to the fact that the house contains memories of those who've lived and died there. So I think Bachelard, I've got the book, it's really hard to read, it's a hard read, and I haven't finished it, but I love the idea. So I just think that's a way, and you can, if you're really into it and you are smart enough to read and understand his book, you can approach books like The Haunting of Hill House, this one here, Careful, The Fall of the House of Usher. You can look at the house through this perspective, and I think if probably you can do your PhD. I reckon you could do your PhD on that one. Anyway, so we talked about the Gothic nature of the house, and we've just really touched on the idea of the house, or the castle in this case, or the fortified manor house, as a model or as a mirror of her psychic state. I don't mean psychic in the sense of clairvoyance and mental state, I suppose. The only solace that she has is with her dogs, and we've also touched on this. Maybe is Edith Wharton's experience from her marriage. Power and control on two levels, really. We see his utter coercion and control over. I mean, it's a classic abusive thing, isn't it? He brings a presence, but he doesn't hit her, but he psychologically dominates her. She's not allowed. I mean, if she goes and picks a flower, she has a maid sent with her because he's so jealous and controlling. That I don't even think that's the implication. I think he says that if you keep a treasure, you don't leave the key in the door. So he wants to control his resource, his possession, which is this young wife. He won't let her go anywhere. And of course, when she goes eventually with this posh relative to a pardon, these are in the west of Brittany, these are religious festivals related to saints. They still go on today, and they're a big deal. And so, and then she meets this chap, even briefly, but because she's so starved of love, I think it's like a match to Tinder, dry Tinder. And it just, you can imagine setting up a longing for a different life. And it rains all the time, of course, and of course that's part of the Gothic, but also a reflection of her mental state. Now, I was going to say about the two levels of control, the two aspects of control that this guy, Yves de Corneau, employs. First off, on his wife. Secondly, hanging your serfs. So these people belong to you. They were just... what is the difference between them and a slave? They were bound to the land. They weren't allowed to go anywhere else. They had to work for you. And also, if they had time, well, they would have to feed themselves from their own allotted pieces of land. You, as Lord, could kill them when you wanted, and did. And he, nearly killed a young horse as well. It's interesting that the servants, the dogs, the wife, the horse are all possessions of this man, and he can do what he wants with them. So it leads to questions of gender, of course, but I don't think Wharton makes a big deal of the fact that he's a man. He clearly is a man, and it clearly is men that had this power, but I think it's just, she just portrays it as is. So she's not critiquing men qua men, men as men. She is just giving a mirror to it. This is how it was, and it wasn't good. And for the horses, dogs, women, or serfs. So I think that's really interesting, but I don't think she's making a very strong feminist point there, although you could read it that way. You could do your PhD on that as well. So again, and the classic Gothic mechanism, but with a twist. The ghosts are agents of retribution. Great wrong has been done to these creatures, and they get their revenge. And their revenge is mirrored in the wife's state. It's almost like the wife would will them to do it. Her love for the dogs, and the fact that they pay him back for his cruelty to both her and them, it might be something that she would have wished and willed, although it doesn't work out too well for her because she gets locked up and dies insane in the house. Very Gothic, of course. But so there's no happy ending particularly, is there? The frame allows us to step back from that, because the protagonist in this case, if the protagonist had gone through this, say she'd done away with the two-part story and we'd just had her Anne's life, that would have been a very bleak, hard story. But because it's shown to us through the eyes of somebody who makes no moral comment on it, really, when in reading this story, he doesn't, you can infer it, but he doesn't explicitly, unless I'm missing something, it doesn't make a big deal anyway of the terrible wrongs. I mean, I think he feels for her, but he isn't massively internally affected by it. He's not breaking down in tears or screaming with the injustice of it, is he? The protagonist. He's distanced, and I think that is a kind of like an insulation for us as well. Maybe not for you, but for me, I'm hard as nails anyway. I'm used to all this stuff. So it doesn't scare me or it doesn't work for me, but I think it's really interesting. So I think we may have said all we need to say about it. There's probably a lot more to say. I liked it. People, if you go on Goodreads, don't rate it as one of their best stories, but another thing that Edith Wharton does with her ghost stories, like Bewitched, like Mr. Jones, even to an extent afterward, though not as strong. The Pomegranate Seed, all these stories we've done on the podcast, she typically leaves an ambiguity. So, like M.R. James's, of course, but and then they're contemporaries. But in this, it's not so ambiguous. I don't think she does it, and maybe that's why people say it's not one of her classics. But because it's not so ambiguous, it's perhaps more accessible. It is a ghost story. A terrible wrong was done. The only ghosts are the ghosts of the dogs, but they serve the absolute function of a ghost, of one of the functions of a ghost, which is to exact revenge and to right wrongs, and they do that. Good on them for doing it. So I'm a bit scared about going downstairs. I think mine are asleep, but if they've heard this story, they might think they're gonna get the better of me and slurp on me. I think that was the thing. Anyway, there we are. So yeah, a good story, I thought. Another good one. I like Edith Wharton. I've said that about 1,500 times, but it's true. Final thing to say is a lot of people have begged me on their knees to add music. You remember I cut the music for those of you who want to sleep, as a majority of people want the music back. So to please them, here it is. I saw him watching me in the wide mirror of the barber's saloon. He was a wiry little man of about 40, with a round bullet-like head, going bald. He was drably dressed in baggy flannels and a faded brown jacket, with a mackintosh over one arm and slouching trilby hat balanced on his knees. He seemed a subdued and insignificant figure, yet there was something disturbingly familiar about him. His face, which was rather ugly with protruding front teeth and deep unsightly eye sockets, was not a stranger's face. Something about it provoked in me an odd feeling of impending surprise, of startled recognition to come. I felt I ought to have known his face immediately, but somehow it remained shadowy and indefinable, slightly and worryingly outside the focus of my understanding. It was about 4 o'clock, and I dropped in for a shave on my way home from work. I was leaning back with my eyes half closed, pretending to be immersed in an animated conversation with the barber, and I don't think the little man realised I had observed his interest. I remembered that he'd come into the barber shop just behind me. I'd taken the proffered shaving chair while he had taken off his hat and mackintosh and sat down on the bench for waiting customers. As far as I knew, he had picked up one of the newspapers on the bench and started reading it. It was only by chance, while the barber was filling the hot water mug from a can in the corner, that I happened to look in the mirror and see the little man staring across the room with bright, burning eyes. With sudden uneasiness, I realised his gaze was aimed specifically in my direction. It wasn't a casual, not a mildly curious gaze, but rather the fierce, almost wolfish gaze of a man who had suddenly set eyes on a prey for which he had long been seeking. The eyes seemed to burn into the mirror with a sort of consuming hatred. I felt a chill creep into my reclining body. Of course, I was being quite ridiculous, I told myself, fighting hard against a tremendous desire to turn my head away and pretend it was all a dream. I was imagining things. In a moment or so, I would see the man's eyes drift away and return in bored and concern to their newspaper. But unfortunately, they did not. They remained instead fixed unwaveringly upon me, 2 pinpoints of steely menace that bored into my very existence. They seemed to be alight with an evil flame, and they were growing brighter and brighter. I stuck it for a while, wriggling uncomfortably in my seat and trying unsuccessfully to let the monotone of the barber's voice lull me into a sense of security. Then I felt the little man's gaze becoming fiercer, more impelling, and I began to get really perturbed. "For God's sake, hurry up and finish," I muttered to the barber out of the corner of my mouth, so that the little man wouldn't notice. I drummed my fingers nervously on the side of my chair while the barber, disgruntled, gave a hasty wipe of a towel over my face, then roughly whisked off the cover sheet. As I rose from the chair, I looked casually into the mirror. The eyes of the little man rose upwards with me, following my movements steadily. I couldn't be quite sure. His face was still blurred, but it seemed that a quick look of cunning flitted across his face, as if he were making some rapid decision to cope with a new problem created by my imminent departure. For a moment I hesitated, wondering if he would rise and dutifully take the seat which the barber was now politely offering to him. Indeed, he was beginning to rise, but some flash of intuition warned me that he had no intention of taking the seat. I hastily thrust a coin into the barber's hand. "Keep the change," I said hurriedly. Then I grabbed up my mackintosh and hat and ran out of the shop, swinging the door back behind me viciously. I didn't care to look back, but I felt sure that the little man had come after me. I began walking down the street as fast as I could without actually running, intent on finding some sort of hiding place. When I came to a Woolworths on the corner, I darted through the entrance. Inside there was a thick crowd of shoppers. I threaded my way among them, burrowing deeper and deeper into the mass of sticky humanity. When I reached the stationery counter at the far end of the shop, I felt safer. Looking back, I could see a jumble of housewives, old men and children, but no sign of the little man. I breathed easier and began walking slowly up and down the counter. I felt a tempting sensation of relief stealing over me. It would be all right now. Probably the little man's view had been temporarily blocked at the particular moment I stepped into Woolworths. He would have gone hurrying by. I'd give him a few minutes, then come out of the shop and get a bus home. I began wandering from counter to counter, looking at the goods with idle curiosity. I passed from stationery to kitchenware, then to hardware, then back to stationery. Passing the hardware counter for the third time, I felt an assistant eyeing me and hastily picked up a coloured mixing bowl. "I'll take this," I said, smiling brightly at her. She took my silver and moved away to get change. I found myself smiling into a long, rather dirty mirror which lined the wall behind the counter. I went on smiling rather mechanically, then felt the grin slowly freeze across my face. Standing at the counter, behind me, I could see the little man, his slouch hat pulled down over his eyes, his mackintosh thrown untidily over his shoulder. He was pretending to examine a writing pad, but all the time his eyes were darting around the shop. Feeling like a hypnotized rabbit, I stood there without moving and watched his gaze travel round until it alighted abruptly on me. For a moment we remained like two statues. Then the little man started to move. I had an extraordinary feeling that he was going to vault over the counter towards me. Crying out in sudden terror, I dropped the bowl on the edge of the counter, cracking it into a dozen pieces, and started running down the corridor leading to the nearest exit. Behind me, I heard the startled cry of the assistant. Shoppers and other assistants turned a sea of surprised faces in my direction, but before they could make any move to stop me, I had plunged through an exit swing door. As I did so, I fancied I caught a glimpse of the little man, irritably pushing his way through the converging crowd of people. Outside, in the street, again, I felt bare and defenceless, like an animal caught in the open. Seeing another big store on the other side of the road, I made a dash for it, skipping neatly across the path of a tram and passing smoothly through a revolving door. As I went in, I looked across the road and saw the Woolworths store bursting open, and I knew that he was after me. This was one of the higher class stores, mostly clothing and drapery. The tall counters and drooping fabrics offered some excellent cover. I hurriedly skirted round the shop, keeping an occasional eye on the entrance to see if the little man would come in. Unfortunately, while doing this, I backed into a precarious tower of carpet rolls and brought the whole lot tumbling down, spread-eagling me on the floor. Terrified by a sudden fear that the little man would come leaping down on me, I scrambled to my feet and started running away without waiting to repair the damage, taking with me a blurred vision of a shopwalker's stout reddening face convulsed with indignation. I went on, turning 2 or 3 corners, passing through the ladies' underwear and brassiere sections. Then I began to wonder whether, during my accident, the little man had entered the shop and was even now waiting for me behind some tall display stand. It would certainly be safer to transfer myself to some other floor. Looking around, I saw a convenient sign pointing lifts. I hurried along, and in luck's way, I found the lift waiting. The uniformed girl about to close the gate. "Hey, wait!" I cried, running up. The girl smiled demurely and stepped aside. I went in and flopped onto a welcome bench. The girl called out, "Going up!" Some other passengers crowded in after me. Then she clanged the gate and the lift started rising. Something made me take uneasy stock of my surroundings. My nearest neighbours were 2 faded old ladies out for an afternoon shopping. Next to them were a mother and a small girl. Beyond her, I caught a glimpse of the side of a man's face. There was something about it. One of the old ladies turned, sweeping her wide-brimmed hat out of my line of vision. Then indeed I nearly died. The little man was standing exactly opposite, with only 1 or 2 women between us. At the sight of me, a ferocious grin split his face into an evil mask. His drawn-back lips seemed about to mouth fearful epithets. For the first time, I realized how incomparably sinister a figure he was, how threatening was the whole of his hard, shriveled-up, menacing presence. Now, indeed, there was no longer any room for doubt, no chance of pretending otherwise than that it was a chase for life or death. My tongue parched in my mouth. I tried to utter words. "Help!" I said. "Help!" I thought I was crying out, but the words must have stuck in my throat. "What floor did you say?" said the lift girl, looking at me. I didn't reply. I just stared fascinatedly at the little man, and he stared back at me. I noticed he had a small unkempt moustache and a stubble of beard, and a sharp, pointed nose. I suddenly thought of a miniature Mephistopheles. At any moment he would brush aside the old ladies with a wave of his hand. "3rd floor," said the lift girl, unemotionally. "Hey, let me get out!" I cried wildly. With a terrific surge of strength, I seized one of the old ladies round her waist and half lifted, half threw her into the path of the little man. Then I dived out of the lift, knocking the surprised lift girl against the side. Seeing some stairs running beside the lift shaft, I darted to them and began bounding down them 2 at a time. I heard someone call out after me, "He must be mad! Stop him!" It was probably the old lady, or more likely the little fella. He would be after me down the stairs like a terrier. I beat him to the exit, however. I flew out of that store even faster than I'd left Woolworths. This time, I gave up all pretense and began running hell for leather down the street. I saw people staring at me, and a policeman raised his eyebrows, but I didn't care how much attention I aroused. I only wanted to get a long way away. I ran the whole length of the main shopping street and then took a turning at random into a smaller secondary street. I was puffing. It was some years since I'd done any running. The trouble was my lunch was still a weight on me. It had been a good and heavy one, and I bitterly regretted my 2 mild and bitters. I could hear them swishing about inside me. Looking back, I couldn't see any sign of the little man, so I slackened my run to a panting walk. I wasn't fool enough to think I'd given him the slip, but at least I had time to think and manoeuvre. Although I could hear my heart beating with heavy thuds, I felt much cooler in the head. I remembered reading in detective stories that danger sharpened the brain. Well, something like that was happening to me. It was high time I forgot all about how 3/4 of an hour ago I'd been walking home from work like I'd done for 19 years, and how I'd thought it might be a good idea to have a shave. I like now and then to have the thing done professionally. It was high time I forgot all about that and concentrated on the job in hand. Here I was, walking down a dusty side street which I didn't rightly recognise, going in the opposite direction to my home in the suburbs, and not far behind, a little man with a bullet head was after me, peeping in and out of the shop fronts. I gave him credit for that. He looked a thorough sort. I would have to fox him, and fox him properly. It couldn't be done lightly. It had to be thought out carefully. I seemed to be moving into the business quarters. I passed big blocks of offices inhabited by hundreds of formal unknown messes. I wondered whether to slip into one of the buildings and hide for a while, but decided the risk of arousing suspicion, possibly of being captured by a truculent commissionaire, was too great. I went on, walking about twice as fast as would ordinarily be the case. It was tiring, but it helped to keep up my morale. I kept crossing from one side of the road to another and taking right turns and then left turnings. In this way, I reckoned to mix the little man up a good deal. Also, in the process, I got myself completely lost. Indeed, I was gradually overcome by a fantastic feeling that I was now in a completely strange town, without any knowledge of locality or direction. It was possible that, in fact, many of the streets were normally familiar to me. But, as I turned down one street and up another, I began to feel that I was in some gigantic maze, whose towering walls were nebulous and unreal. Twice I became so lost that I found myself back at the street corner which I'd passed a few moments previously. On the third occasion that this happened, I found myself walking back on my tracks and saw some way ahead of me a disturbance at the street crossing. I didn't know how he'd done it, but I guessed that the little fellow was on my trail again, pushing his way through a crowd. I turned round and began running again. It was exciting, in a way. There was always a persistent thrill of danger arising out of the knowledge that I was being chased. There was, too, always the possibility of my coming round a corner and walking straight into the little man. I wondered which of us would have had the presence of mind to act first. I rather prided myself that we would at least be about even. I'd worked out a very neat plan for lowering my head, butting him hard in the stomach, and then dashing away. When, coming round the corner, I bumped straight into a tall, heavy policeman, knocking him sideways and staggering backwards myself. "I'm terribly sorry, officer," I said. Then I didn't wait for any more, because I recognised his face and knew that I'd already walked past him 4 times in 4 different streets. I had a dim idea that he shouted something after me, but by that time I'd disappeared down an alleyway. It was a very long alley, and towering buildings shut out most of the light. I walked along it feeling more and more alone and frightened. When I eventually emerged from it into a rather dingy shopping street, I was so exhausted after 3 imaginary encounters in the shadows of the little man, and one terrifying episode in which I saw the policeman starting towards me out of a lamppost, that there was a sweat dripping off my forehead and a weak feeling in my legs. That's the trouble with being chased. It doesn't matter really who's chasing you. If it goes on long enough, it gets to the stage where you feel like everybody's chasing you. For instance, it wasn't long before I was going round not only with the little man and the big policeman on my track, but also with the knowledge that if I passed their way again at least 3 other people, a vegetable stall man, a newspaper seller and a squat Jewish woman shopkeeper, would decide I was either a criminal or a madman and start chasing me themselves. For that reason, I made a concentrated effort to move steadily away from the district where I'd been wandering for an hour or so. When I came out into the shopping street, one of the suburban type, I knew that I was succeeding to some extent. The street was less crowded, there was more space between the buildings, and the trams had that emptying look as if they were penetrating further and further out of town. All this time, it was true, I hadn't seen the little man, but I knew that he was after me. There was something so very sure about him. that I felt he wouldn't be thrown off easily. Indeed, I remembered once seeing a film about something like that, where a fellow was chased all over the place by a gunman. No matter what this man did, the gunman kept tracking him down. In the end, he cornered him in his own sitting room with his wife in a faint on the door and shot him 3 times through the head. It turned out, of course, that the fellow being chased had played a dirty trick on the gunman in the past, so it was all made to seem quite reasonable. My trouble was that I felt quite sure that the little man would keep finding me, but I couldn't for the life of me think of any reason for his interest. It was possible he hadn't got a gun. I shivered. His eyes were bad enough. But it was possible he had. I was glad that I hadn't gone home, following my first impulse. At least I wouldn't drag my wife into it. I hadn't forgotten my wife. I knew that already she would be somewhat worried. Most evenings I got home by 5 o'clock, and we always had supper at 6. Well, now it was after 6, and getting to be dusk. Several times I thought, well, I'll phone her anyway, and crossed over to a telephone box. But each time I went inside and heard the door bang on me, a terrifying feeling come over me. There I was, all nicely cooped up in an oblong box. The next moment I would see the little man glaring in through the glass panes. The moment I had that thought, I pushed back the door and dashed out of the box. What's more, I was always pretty sure that if I hadn't done so, he would have been round the corner and on top of me. I felt happier on the move. The trouble was that I'd suddenly become conscious of my physical body. I was tired, dead tired. Not for 10 years had I walked and run so much. My head urged me to wander on until I'd shaken off the little man. My legs and the rest of my body just ached and ached. Aching like that can wear down anything, even the most rigid of purposes. It just goes on, gets heavier and wearier until you feel you drop down dead about 3 steps forward. I didn't see much point in that. I began looking round for some shelter. Besides, it was getting dark, and there might be some real chance of giving him the slip. Picked in the end on a small cinema tucked away among a block of shops, it suddenly struck me as a brilliant idea. I fished 2 bob out of my pocket and darted in, thrusting the money at the box office girl, grabbing the ticket and plunging into the welcome darkness. It was all smoky and hazy inside, but it was shelter. I found a seat at the end of a row. It was soft and cushioned. I sank into it with a sensuous feeling of comfort. I stretched my legs out luxuriously, leaned with heavy pleasure on the armrest, turned my attention to the screen and tried to forget about the little man. It was about 2 minutes from the end of the big picture, something about a matador in Spain, a scene, a bullfight finale, when I heard the little man coming into the cinema. There's no explaining how or why. I just knew it was him. There was a faint light from the door, then I saw a shadow, a small shadow, floating down the aisle. There wasn't a girl or anyone else, just him, who was pretending to be a stranger looking round casually for a seat. But I was watching him like a hawk, and I saw him stop at the end of my row and slide himself into the first seat. A moment later he was sitting in the 5th seat, then he dropped into the 7th seat. There were 4 seats between him and me, and the bull in the film was just making its death charge when I leaped out of my seat and fled towards the cinema exit. It was a familiar feeling, only this time I did it quicker than ever before. I fancy even the little man was surprised. It was dark when I got outside. It gave me a feeling of security, just like the cinema. I began loitering past the shops, trying to catch the sound of the little man's footsteps. The next thing that happened was someone shone a torch full on me, dazzling me, bathing me in relentless light. There wasn't time for any thinking. I just lowered my head and made a wild rush at the light. I think my head went about straight into the centre of her stomach. The light went out and I heard a strangled ouch of pain. I must admit it gave me a thrill of sadistic pleasure that moment. The action was so completely and devastatingly successful, it put me temporarily in supreme control of the situation. I felt a shadow sprawling on the pavement and started running away into the darkness. The wind was on my face as I vanished into the darkness. Indeed, it was almost exhilarating. I guessed that I'd made him mad. I heard some shouting and saw the torch come on again, whirling savagely. I also heard the surprising sound of a shrill whistle. A few minutes later there was an answering whistle somewhere ahead of me. These things happening one after the other got me rather confused, but I had enough presence of mind to take a turning and sprint down it deep into the night. I had to stop running pretty soon. I had to lean against the lamppost and take great heaving breaths. Otherwise, I felt I should have collapsed. I stood there for several tense moments, getting my breath back, and at the same time listening to the sound of chasing footsteps. But by some miracle, the quiet remained unbroken. My ears had to be content with the dull rustle of wind in the treetops that lined the road, and with far-off occasional hoots of cars. It was very eerie indeed. For I suddenly realised, because there were no footsteps, it didn't mean I was not being followed. I would be a fool not to concede more than average intelligence to the little man. He was the sort, I decided, visualising his small, crafty face, alive with hidden cunning, who would possibly wrap cloth over his boots, or even take them off. In a flash, all sense of temporary relief vanished. Standing there, I became aware with a blinding horror that every shadow, however vague, every rustle, however muffled, might not be what it seemed. Even the solid shapes of the trees might not be real. I think it was when I got to that state of mind that I gave up all efforts to preserve my morality, my sense of ethics, my character of an ordinary citizen who somehow was previously had been sitting in his respectable office, doing his respectable job, there, swimming in the menacing shadows of a suburban residential street. I gave it all up, became the hunted fugitive, the animal who must use his cunning, not only to outwit his chaser, but to dispose of him. I can remember how clear and simple it all became. It was as if a tremendous load had fallen away. I felt a wave of confidence pouring into me. At the same time, I felt myself in powerful control of my senses, became aware of newly acquired strength. I waited not in fear, but in expectancy for what I knew would eventually come. I didn't mind how long the wait now, that I knew exactly what course of action to follow, exactly what events were going to take place, and it was a long way. I felt the cold night air creeping into my clothes, enveloping my feet, my fingers, my ears, sinking into my limbs. I didn't dare stamp or flap my arms for fear of giving my position away, for now the whole essence of success was surprise. I'd moved close into the shadow of a tree, merging myself into its frame. I could not possibly be seen against that dark outline. There I waited, breathing as quietly as possible, hardly daring to move a muscle. In fact, I felt it would be dangerous even to think I might weaken in my new resolve, so I deliberately devoted my mind to counting numbers. I'd reached 145, I think, when I heard him coming. Probably to anyone else it would have just sounded like the rustle of the wind in the trees or a leaf blowing about, but of course that was just what he would have wanted me to think. I envisaged now his triumphant smile, his sense of achievement, and smiled to myself. There was hardly any sound, just that faint, occasional, apparently casual rustle. I can't imitate the sound in writing, but it was rather like somebody turning over the pages of a newspaper, and that, of course, reminded me of how I'd first seen him, sitting there in the barber's shop, so insignificant, so innocent. A huge burning indignation swept over me at the thought of all the trouble he'd given me. What had I ever done to him? Who was he to hound me down like a criminal? What right had he to bring terror into my life? It would take me weeks to recover from that one evening, and my wife, God knows what she would be thinking. I had just reached the apex of these thoughts when I saw him. He was only a few feet away from me, the vaguest of shadows, but a sixth sense told me that it was him. He was sliding along like some dirty little sneak thief. I counted as he came nearer, giving him a certain number of steps to come level. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7! I said out loud. Oh, I might even have shouted it, to startle him. Then I leapt forward and clutched him, and we went rolling to the ground. I had taken him completely by surprise. I was able to get my hands round his neck just where I wanted to. I knew exactly what to do. I'd read it all in considerable detail in a crime novel. I held my fingers firmly into the flesh of his neck, pressing my body hard down on him, and with my 2 thumbs I felt for the narrow stem of his windpipe. I'd got him. I knew I'd got him. I could feel him suddenly struggling convulsively like a drowning man. I maintained my grip, pressing tighter and tighter. I could feel my nails cutting into the flesh of his neck. I could hear the breath ebbing out of him. My stranglehold sank deeper and deeper. Then, suddenly, like an immense nightmare, the darkness seemed to swoop down on me, pouring over me in a gigantic wave of pain. Conscious of a helpless, detached sensation of bewilderment, I felt myself falling away, falling down into deep, black oblivion. When I opened my eyes again, it was no longer dark, but bright daylight. I was no longer fighting for my life in a quiet back street, but lying in bed in a hospital ward, with sunshine pouring through a window and falling in great streaks across the white coverlet. There was a white-coated nurse sitting at a table in one corner. When she saw me open my eyes, she got up and came over. She was smiling. Somehow it warmed me through and through to see her smile. I felt I just wanted to lie back there and drowse away with everything big and white and peaceful, with the sunshine pouring in and the nurse smiling. But there was something stopping me, something small and hard pressing far away at the back of my mind. I didn't quite know what it was, and I couldn't quite express myself. I looked up beseechingly at the nurse. She smiled and bent down, putting a cool hand on my head. "It's all right, you just relax," she said. "You've had a nasty experience, a terrible shock, but you're going to be all right now. You just lie back and go to sleep again." But I couldn't go to sleep, I couldn't. She must have known that, I thought, irritably. I tried to tell her what I wanted with my eyes. I looked at her pleadingly, passionately, begging her to answer my unformed question. For a few moments she stood looking down at me, a puzzled line creasing her forehead. Then she seemed to understand. She gave a wide, reassuring smile. "Now don't you worry. You've had a nasty shock. Some madman tried to strangle you. Your neck's been cut about a bit, but there's nothing permanently damaged. A week or 2 here and we'll be able to pack you off home." I looked at her dumbly. I felt as if I were about to tumble over the edge of a terrifying precipice which had climbed painfully and laboriously. I motioned her nearer, struggling to speak. The words came out at last, each one hurting the dry, swollen lining of my throat. "Please," I said, "please, bring me a mirror." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. She went over to the corner of the room and came back holding a large oval hand mirror. "There you are," she said soothingly. "Only some bandages round your neck. Nothing very frightening, is it?" But I didn't answer. I looked in the mirror, and the face I saw was a familiar one. It was small and ugly, with protruding teeth and sunken eyes, and the head was bald and round, like a bullet. That was Face in the Mirror by Dennis Val Baker. And your question, I think, is a legitimate question, would be why? I don't mean why read that story, I mean why read it in that accent? Well, the truth of it is, I don't meet many people these days, and when I do, I'm out with the dogs, and so that's how I talk. All right, Mara. I don't say Mara. I live in Carlisle now, so they don't say Mara in Carlisle. But all right, not so bad. With weather, terrible day, like aye. So that's me. So I thought I'd do that because, and this is my cunning plan. There are a couple of reasons. I was driving. I'd say I don't meet people. I was driving down the Grasmere today, actually, and I was listening to Simon Roper. Now, if you've never heard of Simon Roper on YouTube, he's a kind of a historical linguist, really, although he'll say he's not formally trained. And I was talking about the great vowel shift and northern versus southern dialects in development there. It was very, very interesting. And he played some old Cumbrian stuff from the 1960s. And I thought, oh yeah, I remember old folk talking like that, you know. My grandmother used to. I did a version of Madame Crowell's Ghost by Sheridan Le Fanu, or Le Fanu, on here in that accent, and I got various comments. One was very rude, used words I can't possibly please. The other one was saying, don't attempt a Geordie accent again. Geordie? I said, there's no Geordie, lass. I said, get yourself out of West Cumberland. If you didn't think nobody speaks like that, get yourself out to Maryport and then you're here, fuck. Yattering on about this, that and t'other. When I worked there, I was working in doctor's surgery, and I remember I had folk come in, and they were proper broad Cumberland. And there was this couple come in, they were going on about fouts. We have all fouts, they said. I says, you what? Fouts? And I've got an ear for Cumbrian dialect. And I thought, fallout. They have their fallouts, you see. So, and then I had a fella complain about, he wrote a comment, I have complained previously about your French accent, but this one wasn't too bad. And he said, sometimes you lay them on a bit thick. And I thought, well, you wait till you hear this, pal. But this is the wrong attitude, isn't it, really? It is, I know it is. But I've been a bit peppered up by... I did my Dracula, and somebody put on my Dracula thing, this AI narration is an abomination. Stop it, stop it, stop it. So I'm like, but I'm a human being. So a number of people asking me if I'm AI, and which is bizarre. You enter into these conversations where you're trying to prove your reality. I feel like I'm something out of the Matrix, you know. And then the other thing is, of course, there's two channels have been, from the artwork, they're the same person. They've been just basically stealing, particularly my detective stories, and putting them up. And I go to YouTube and I go, look, this is copyright, and YouTube are like, well, yeah, what's your problem? Because if it's a story by somebody, you know, it's a public domain story by an author, they're like, yeah, it's public domain. So I go, yeah, but it's my performance. So you have the fruits of that in this video. I am trying to fashion a narrative style which could not be confused for AI, and which is clearly unique to myself. And there you have it. Anyway, I'm going to tell you something sensible now about the story itself. I also thought about leaving all my mistakes in, but sometimes I swear at myself when I make a mistake, and I bang the table and I shout at myself. I think that's one of the things of not seeing many people. You just become weirder and weirder until I'm fairly weird now. I mean, I say that myself. I mean, Sheila says I am as well, so it's probably right. You know, there we are. So I am going to tell you. I was going to leave it with the mistakes in, yeah, but I didn't. I took them out. There were some minor mistakes which I used to take out, like if I mildly mispronounce a word and correct it halfway through, I would take that out. Now I'm thinking, no, because AI wouldn't do that, you see. Anyway, so Dennis Val Baker. Let's have a laugh, chat about that fella there. So now I need to apologise for that chat before. I'm going to tell you something very sensible about Dennis Val Baker. I have to talk about his dad first. So his dad, Valentine Baker, was born in Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr in North Wales, and was in the Royal Air Force. He joined the Royal Navy and was assigned to the Royal Naval Air Service Armoured Car Section, but then he ended up flying with 41 Squadron. Anyway, he was a war hero in the First World War, and he met Dennis Val Baker, the writer's mother, who was from Anglesey. So I'm guessing, was he something to do with the RAF Valley potentially? I'm not really sure. And Dennis Val Baker was born, or Dennis Baker as he was christened, was born in Poppleton near York, where his dad was stationed. There are a number of RAF stations around York in the Vale of York. Now it's interesting that Dennis, who was a lifelong pacifist, was so proud of his war hero father that he changed his name to include Val, his father's shortening of his father's name, Valentine, as his second name. And despite being born in Yorkshire, Dennis Val Baker considered himself Welsh, and oedd ei fam yn canu'r delyn yn y Steddfod. A dwi'n siŵr ond dod o Landau Fechan y cyfnod hynny, debyg iawn fod ei dad a'i fam yn siarad Cymraeg, ond does ddim nodiadau gyda i sy'n awgrymu bod Dennis Baker ei hunan yn medru'r Gymraeg. I'm just trying to fox the AI, you know. Ond mae'n bleser gyda i bob amser i siarad Cymraeg, of course. So Dennis Val Baker was born in 1917 in Poppleton, as I mentioned, in York, just outside York. Well, Poppleton's part of York, isn't it? Yeah. His father, Valentine Henry Baker, was a Welsh-born pilot, as we talked about. His mother, Dilys Eames, was an accomplished harpist from Anglesey who had performed at the National Steddfod in 1901. He was raised in Sussex and later in Surbiton in Surrey, but he strongly identified his Welsh heritage, which I was saying in Welsh. And that was a really important part of his literary career. His father died in a flying accident in 1942, and he legally changed his name to include his dad's name, Val, in his. Dennis Val Baker himself was a writer, editor, and advocate for the arts, and died in 1984 in Penzance in Cornwall. And he was, if you read about him, he's considered a Cornish writer, which is interesting and not something that you would necessarily think of if you didn't know anything about him, given his background. But certainly he was invited to become a member of the Gorsedd of the Bards of Cornwall, but he declined on the grounds that he didn't like dressing up. Fesol fi o Tysgu Cernyweg, Lemon, dydd Mawrth, pob dydd Mawrth, byddaf yn Tysgu Cernyweg. Nins y gym o Cernyweg pyr da, Lemon. Yeah, AI, you better catch me if you can. So one of his first jobs was working as a reporter for the Derby Evening Telegraph, and he moved to London in the late 1930s, and he was a journalist working on trade papers, and he was writing and building connections with the publishing world. During this time when he was in London, he obviously had an interest in writing fiction, which he did, more literary stuff. He actually launched a review magazine called Opus in the early 1940s, later renamed Voices, which was a quarterly magazine that became an important platform for emerging writers. His editorial approach championed experimental and avant-garde writing, providing exposure to new literary voices. His first short story collection, Selected Stories, appeared in 1944, followed by his debut novel, The White Rock, in 1945. And he was seen in those days as a rising star in literature in Britain. As I said, I hinted to, despite his father being a war hero and not a pacifist, he was a committed pacifist, and he registered as a conscientious objector in June 1939. And he was in the Blitz in London. He was doing rescue work. So it wasn't that he was scared. It was hazardous work doing that, but he was pacifist. He volunteered for agricultural work in Jersey in 1940, the island of Jersey. I'm not sure he went, but he then worked at the youth house in Camden Town in London, which was a pacifist community. And so that at that time was kind of like an alternative lifestyle, quite leftist thoughts there. And this is this is an avant-garde guy. He did this. When he was in London, he visited Cornwall, and he eventually moved to Cornwall. And in 1949, he launched the Cornish Review, a quarterly dedicated to the arts and culture of Cornwall. The magazine ran for 10 issues in its first incarnation, and was later revived in 1966 for another 26 issues. He was very hands-on in his publishing. The budgets were tight, but he prioritised the literary quality. He moved to Cornwall and in 1948 permanently, settling at Trencrum Hill near St Ives. He kept going back, and he lived back in London for 3 years, but he made Cornwall his permanent home. And there was a story about how he moved to more and more remote places. He wrote stories inspired by Cornish landscape and folk tales, particularly his autobiographical work such as The Seas in the Kitchen, 1962, which talked about his life in various Cornish places from St Ives to Zenin Cove to Golland. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these Cornish place names. Although I am learning Cornish, but I don't live in Cornwall. So you may know that St Ives became an artist's colony, and Dennis Val Baker had a part in this because he wrote a book called Britain's Art Colony by the Sea in 1959, which was one of the first comprehensive accounts of the St Ives artist colony, and it kind of helped cement this idea of his idea. He did a lot of work promoting the arts in Cornwall, and in the late 1960s he purchased a boat, the MFB Sanu, and this influenced his writing, reflecting his deep engagement with Cornwall's maritime traditions. He moved, as I said, from different places, from St Christopher's overlooking Portmerle Beach in St Ives to the isolated old sawmills, accessible only by boat or railway, and finally to the mill house at Crane, is it, near Land's End, and this sense of place is very important for him. So it's interesting he didn't go to Wales, considering he identified. But I mean, Wales' loss is Cornwall's gain, really, in many ways. And but a very, very interesting man. In terms of the story, I'm not going to say very much about the story. I think we've read stories like this before. I think pretty early on you get an idea of what's happening. I think the two things I want to say about the story: one, the comedy in it. It is relatively comic. It's a comic story in many ways. I maybe want to say three things. The second was the use of, basically it's a chase, and it creates suspense through the chase, and this can be done by writers, and is usually, if it's done well, really well received by readers. And actually nothing much is happening apart from the prey moves, thinks he's safe, is caught again, moves, and ramping up the tension. So it's, if you are a writer, and I'll give you a bit of writing practice now, write me a suspense, I haven't got time to read it, man, but a suspenseful chase scene. If it's a horror chase, it can be a monster chase and whatever, and you just milk it. And one of the really important things is you need to put some detail in this and draw it out and think about it almost as you're reading it out loud. One of the things that helped me in my writing a lot was narrating to live audiences, because you can read the audience. Pauses are really important. And just the build-up is and not revealing and holding off the reveal until the end. So that stands alone as a really useful technique. Okay, the third thing I was going to say, hang on, there's Sheila coming. Yeah, these are just methods of defeating AI, showing that I'm a human being with a real life to live, of Sheila and the dogs, and I've just eaten some chocolate. So AI, you can't eat chocolate, can you? So where was I about? Oh yeah, the third thing I was going to say is some kind of psychological overview of the beast in the mirror. Oh yes, we've all seen it. I look in the mirror sometimes, I think, who's that beast? But I suppose it's about shadow projections, if we wanted to get all psychoanalytical about it, or Jungian, because I like me Jung. So basically, we all have a side that we don't own up, and to become full human beings, we have to acknowledge the wickedness and the monster inside us. The things that we do, we have to own them and mitigate them, I suppose. But certainly, if we maintain a self-image that is completely pure and untarnished, then our darkness is going somewhere. I'm going to tell you a story. I was in the 1990s, when I was living in mid Wales. I used to go to the local church, and after the church service we would have a coffee, and everybody was so nice. They were so nice, and I remember thinking, nobody's really that nice. Now, I'm not actually having a down on the people themselves as individuals. I'm just saying in general terms, if you cultivate the persona which is pure and there is no badness in you at all, your badness has got to go somewhere. And I don't want to extrapolate too much, but if you look at people who professionally, like priests, have to be good all the time, the darkness has got to go somewhere. So what we do is we project it out. So this story in senses of him not recognising the darkness in himself. I don't know how he actually managed to strangle himself. I suppose you can do if you try really hard. I've never tried, but I'm not going to try either. But I suppose, in a sense, that's, if we want to have a reading of the story, it's about how we don't, it leads to mental illness, basically, if we don't own the darkness in ourselves, and we don't reckon ourselves as full human beings. We are unipolar. If we only allow goodness, where is the darkness going to go? We have to own our darkness and be fully responsible for it. And I'm not saying I do, I still project out. But one of the secrets about finding your projections is if there's a particular group of people that you hate, then that's a good sign. I think, I don't know if Freud said this, but I used to say when I was working, like I worked in a GP surgery the last 4 or 5 years rather than in specialist mental health units. And I would say to people coming in, I would say, we're going to do a bit of exploration, and where it hurts, that's where the problem is. And it's like you go and see a physical doctor and they palpate your stomach, and where it hurts is where the problem is. And that's true psychologically as well. So, and in terms of physical pain, if we substitute that for emotional attachment, either we hate something or we love it too much, or we have this inordinate emotional reaction to whatever. We hate this kind of person. That is a sign that there is some kind of psychic imbalance, and they actually have some of our, what Freud would call our libido, our psychic energy there, only because we're giving it away to them. So in a sense, I suppose this story can be understood as a parable of a man who projects out his darkness, because at the end we recognise, remember, I've said in many of these stories before, how we equate the good and the beautiful, we think, and the Greeks did this, and I've said this as well. We tend to think what is beautiful is good, and I'm not saying we know rationally it isn't, but we respond to the beautiful as if it's the good, and we respond to the good as if it's the beautiful. We often see good things as being beautiful, and we think beautiful things are good, and then we sit back, we go, no, that's not true, because we're not stupid, but we react as if it is, and we also see the ugly as the evil, the other side of the coin. So we tend to see physically ugly things as being evil. They're contaminated with evil. And that is just as untrue as seeing the good and the beautiful as being perpetually conjoined. So he's evil and he's ugly at the same time, isn't he? And so that's what I think. Those are the 3 things I want to say about the story. I think the man is really interesting. I think the story can be understood as a relatively skin-deep story of projection. It's quite darkly funny, but also and it's basically just a chase, isn't it? So and I'm saying that you can effectively create a very gripping story that is nothing but a chase. There's the music. That is my cue to go. I'm sorry for being a bit crazy, but there we are. Actually, it made me think. I do want to say something else. I'm going to have to turn this music off. AI will never be able to be as crazy as me. It won't be allowed to be. And that made me think about how they've sanitized and put all this safetyism stuff around AI. So if you go on an AI art program and you say, look, I want a thumbnail of a gore spatter day, it goes, this breaches our community standards. And it is related. So AI reflects our cultivation of purity. So we have this performative pureness, our persona. We must be kind, good, be kind. We must be all of these things. So where's the darkness? Because it's got to go somewhere. So if you have an AI which reflects our Western view that we must only be good, where is the darkness? Well, the darkness isn't, you don't have to go too far to find it, but it's as if our culture demands that we are not dark at all where we are. There we are. That is a whole subject in itself, isn't it? Right, back to the Heartwood Institute, and some come back. The Open Window by Saki. I don't normally say this, but the noise you can hear in the background, well, it's the heavy rain. It's forecast to continue all day and possibly all night and possibly all tomorrow, so I simply don't have any other time to do this. I hope you will enjoy it nevertheless. So, The Open Window by Saki. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nurrow, said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Frampton Nuttall endeavoured to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure, which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, are quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people round here?" asked the niece when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communion. "Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Sappleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That would be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow, in this restful country spot, tragedy seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It's quite warm for the time of year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? Out through that window 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favourite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places that were safe in other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor aunt always thinks that they'll come back some day, they and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in at that window just as they used to do. That is why the window's kept open every evening till it's quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she's often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing 'Bertie, why do you bound?' as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they'll all walk through that window." She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apology for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera's been amusing you," she said. "She's been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Stapleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partially successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visits on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who laboured under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No?" said Mrs. Sappleton in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for tea. Don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes, in a chill shock of nameless fear. Frampton swung round in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was that who bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "He'll only talk about his illness and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he'd seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs, and had to spend a night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling and grinning and foaming just above him. Enough to make anyone lose their nerve." Romance at short notice was her speciality. Well, that had been requested by a listener, and I've wanted to do it for quite a long time, but it is very short, and I don't want you to feel cheated, so I'm going to do another short one. Not by Saki, but by R. Murray Gilchrist. This is called The Return. You'll hear that it's still raining. The Return by R. Murray Gilchrist. 5 minutes ago I drew the curtain aside and let the mellow sunset light contend with the glare from the girandoles. Below lay the orchard of Vernon Garth, rich in heavily flowered fruit trees. Yonder a medlar, here a pear, next a quince. As my eyes, unaccustomed to the day, blinked rapidly, the recollection came of a scene 45 years past, and once more, beneath the oldest tree, stood the girl I loved, mischievously plucking yarrow, and, despite its evil omen, twining the snowy clusters in her black hair. Again her coquettish words rang in my ears. "Make me thy lady, make me the richest woman in England, and I promise thee, Brian, we shall be the happiest of God's creatures." And I remember how the mad thirst for gold filled me, how I trusted in her fidelity, and, without reasoning or even telling her that I would conquer fortune for her sake, I kissed her sadly and passed into the world. Then followed a complete silence until the Star of Europe, the greatest diamond discovered in modern times, lay in my hand. A rough, unpolished stone, not unlike the lumps of spar I'd often seen lying on the sandy lanes of my native county. This should be Rose's own, and all the others that clanked so melodiously in their leather bulse should go towards fulfilling her ambition. Rich and happy I should be soon, and should I not marry an untitled gentlewoman sweet in her prime? The 20 years interval of work and sleep was like a fading dream, for I was going home. The knowledge thrilled me so that my nerves were strung tight as iron ropes, and I laughed like a young boy, and it was all because my home was to be in Rose Pascal's arms. I crossed the sea and posted straight for Halkerton village. The old hostelry was crowded. Jane Hopgarth, whom I remembered a ruddy-faced child, stood on the box-edged terrace, curtsying in matronly fashion to the departing mail coach. A change in the signboard drew my eye. The white lilies had been painted over with a mitre, and the name changed from the Paschal Arms to the Lord Bishop. Angrily aghast at this disloyalty, I cross-questioned the ostlers who hurried to and fro, but failing to obtain any coherent reply, I was fain to content myself with a mental denunciation of the times. At last I saw bow-legged Jeffreys, now bent double with age, sunning himself at his favourite place, the side of the horse trough. As of old, he was chewing a straw. No sign of recognition came over his face as he gazed at me, and I was shocked because I wished to impart some of my gladness to a fellow creature. I went to him, and after trying in vain to make him speak, held forth a gold coin. He rose instantly, grasped it with palsied fingers, and muttering that the hounds were starting, hurried from my presence. Feeling half sad, I crossed to the churchyard and gazed through the gated window of the Pascal burial chamber at the recumbent and undisturbed effigies of Geoffrey Pascal, gentleman of Bretton Hall, and Margaret Maltrevor, his wife, with their quaint epitaph about a perfect marriage enduring forever. Then, after noting the rankness of the Dachshund nettles, I crossed the worn stile, and with footsteps surprisingly fleet, passed towards the stretch of moorland at whose further end stands Bretton Hall. Twilight had fallen ere I reached the cottage at the entrance of the park. This was in ruinous condition. Here and there sheaves in the thatched roof had parted and formed crevices through which smoke filtered. Some of the tiny windows had been walled up, and even where the glass remained, snake-like ivy hindered any light from falling into their thick recesses. The door stood open, although the evening was chill. As I approached, the heavy autumnal dew shook down from the firs and fell upon my shoulders. A bat, swooping in an undulation, struck between my eyes and fell to the grass, moaning querulously. I entered. A withered woman sat beside the peat fire. She held a pair of steel knitting needles which she moved without cessation. There was no thread upon them, and when they clicked, her lips twitched as if she had counted. Some time passed before I recognized Rose's foster mother, Elizabeth Careless. The russet colour of her cheeks had faded and left a sickly grey. Those sunken, dimmed eyes were utterly unlike the bright black orbs that had danced so mirthfully. Her stature, too, had shrunk. I was struck with wonder. Elizabeth could not be more than 56 years old. I had been away 20 years. Rose was 15 when I'd left her, and I heard Elizabeth say that she was only 21 at the time of her darling's weaning. But what a change! She had such an air of weary grief that my heart grew sick. Advancing to her side, I touched her arm. She turned, but neither spoke nor seemed aware of my presence. Soon, however, she rose, and helping herself along by grasping the scanty furniture, tottered to a window and peered out. Her right hand crept to her throat. She untied the string of her gown and took from her bosom a pomander set in a battered silver case. I cried out. Rose had loved that toy in her childhood. Thousands of times we had played ball with it. Elizabeth held it to her mouth and mumbled it as if it were a baby's hand. Maddened with impatience, I caught her shoulder and roughly bade her say where I should find Rose. But something awoke in her eyes, and she shrank away to the other side of the house-place. I followed. She cowered on the floor, looking at me with a strange horror. Her lips began to move, but they made no sound. Only when I crossed to the threshold did she rise, and then her head moved wildly from side to side, and her hands pressed close to her breast, as if the pain there were too great to endure. I ran from the place, not daring to look back. In a few minutes I reached the balustraded wall of the whole garden. The vegetation there was wonderfully luxuriant. As of old, the great blue and white Canterbury bells grew thickly, and those curious flowers to which tradition has given the name of Marie's heart still spread their creamy tendrils and blood-coloured bloom on every hand. But Pascal's dribble, the tiny spring whose water pulsed so fiercely as it emerged from the earth, had long since burst its bounds, and converted the winter garden into a swamp, where a miniature forest of Queen of the Meadow filled the air with melancholy sweetness. The house looked as if no careful hand had touched it for years. The elements had played havoc with its oriels, and many of the latticed frames hung on single hinges. The curtain of the blue parlour hung outside, draggled and faded and half hidden by a thick growth of bindweed. With an almost savage force I raised my arm high above my head and brought down my fist upon the central panel of the door. There was no need for such violence, for the decayed fastenings made no resistance, and some of the rotten boards fell to the ground. As I entered the hall and saw the ancient furniture, once so fondly kept, now mildewed and crumbling to dust, quick sobs burst from my throat. Rose's spinet stood beside the door of the withdrawing room. How many carols had we sung to its music? As I passed, my foot struck one of the legs, and the rickety structure groaned as if it were coming to pieces. I thrust out my hand to steady it, but at my touch the velvet covering of the lid came off, and the tiny gilt ornaments rattled downwards. The moon was just rising, and only half her disk was visible over the distant edge of the Hell Garden. The light in the room was very uncertain, yet I could see that the keys of the instrument were stained brown and bound together with thick cobwebs. Whilst I stood beside it, I felt an overpowering desire to play a country ballad with an overword of Willow Browbound. The words, in strict accordance with the melody, are merry and sad by turns, at one time filled with light happiness, at another bitter as the voice of one bereaved forever of joy. So I cleared off the spiders and began to strike the keys with my forefinger. Many were done, and when I struck them gave forth no sound save a peculiar sigh, but still the melody rhythmed as distinctly as if a low voice crooned it out of the darkness. Wearied by bitterness, I turned away. By now the full moonlight pierced the window and quivered on the floor. As I gazed on the tremulous pattern, it changed into quaint devices of hearts, daggers, rings, and 1,000 tokens more. All suddenly, another object glided in amongst them so quickly that I wondered whether my eyes had been at fault. A tiny satin shoe, stained crimson across the lappets. A revulsion of feeling came to my soul and drove away all my fear. I had seen that self-same shoe, white and unsoiled, 20 years before, when vain Rose danced among her reapers at the harvest home. And my voice cried out in ecstasy, "Rose, heart of mine, delight of all the world's delights!" She stood before me, wondering, amazed. Alas, so changed. The red and yellow silk shawl still covered her shoulders. Her hair still hung in those eldritch curls, but the beautiful face had grown wan and tired, and across the forehead lines were drawn like silver threads. She threw her arms around my neck and, pressing her bosom heavily on mine, sobbed so piteously that I grew afraid for her, and drew back the long masses of hair which had fallen forward, and kissed again and again those lips that were too lovely for simile. Never came a word of chiding from them. "Love," she said, when she had regained her breath. "The past struggle was sharp and torturing. The future struggle will be crueler still. What a great love was yours, to wait and trust for so long. Would that mine had been as powerful. Poor weak heart, it could not endure." The tones of a wild fear throbbed through all her speech, strongly, yet with insufficient power to prevent her feeling the tenderness of those moments. Often, timorously raising her head from my shoulder, she looked about, and then turned with a soft, inarticulate, and glad murmur to hide her face on my bosom. I spoke fervently, told of the years spent away from her, how, when working in the diamond fields, she had been ever present in my fancy, how at night her name had fallen from my lips in my only prayer, how I had dreamed of her amongst the greatest in the land, the richest, and I dare swear the loveliest woman in the world. I grew warmer still. All the gladness which had been constrained for so long now burst wildly from my lips, a myriad of rich ideas resolved into words which, being spoken, were one long and delicious fit of passion. As we stood together, the moon brightened and filled the chamber with a light like the day's. The ridges of the surrounding moorlands stood out in sharp relief. Rose drank in my declarations thirstily, but soon interrupted me with a heavy sigh. "Come away," she said softly. "I no longer live in this house. You must stay with me tonight. This place is so wretched now, for time that in you and me has only strengthened love, has wrought much ruin here." Half leaning on me, she led me from the precincts of Bretton Hall. We walked in silence over the waste that crowns the valley of the White Lands, and, being near the verge of the rocks, saw the great pine woods sloping downwards, lighted near us by the moon, but soon lost in density. Along the mysterious line where the light changed into gloom, intricate shadows of withered summer bracken struck and receded in a mimic battle. Before us lay the Priest's Cliff. The moon was veiled by a grove of elms, whose ever-swaying branches alternately increased and lessened her brightness. This was a place of notoriety, a veritable Golgotha, a haunt fit only for demons. Murder and theft had been punished here, and to this day fireside stories are told of evil women dancing round that druid circle, carrying hearts plucked from gibbeted bodies. "Rose," I whispered, "why have you brought me here?" She made no reply, but pressed her head more closely to my shoulder. Scarce had my lips closed, hear a sound, like the hiss of a half-strangled snake, vibrated amongst the trees. It grew louder and louder. A monstrous shadow hovered above. Rose from my bosom murmured, "Love is strong as death. Love is strong as death." I locked her in my arms so tightly that she grew breathless. "Hold me," she panted. "You're strong." A cold hand touched our foreheads so that, benumbed, we sank together to the ground, to fall instantly into a dreamless slumber. When I awoke, the clear grey light of early morning had spread over the country. Beyond the Hell Garden, the sun was just bursting through the clouds, and had already spread a long golden haze along the horizon. The babbling of the streamlet that runs down to Holkton was so distinct that it seemed almost at my side. How sweetly the wild thyme smelt! Filled with the tender recollections of the night, without turning, I called Rose Pascal from her sleep. "Sweetheart, sweetheart, waken, 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 see how glad the world looks, see the omens of a happy future." No answer came. I sat up, and looking round me, saw that I was alone. A square stone lay near. When the sun was high, I crept to read the inscription carved thereon. "Here, at 4 cross paths, lieth, with a stake through the bosom, the body of Rose Pascal, who in her 16th year wilfully cast away the life God gave." So that was 2 stories, whose only connection... Well, there are a couple of connections, actually. The short, they are bordering on the supernatural. Certainly the second one is supernatural, the first one is not supernatural, but pretends to be. Or leads us down that alleyway, doesn't it? Leads us down the garden path a little bit. They were very near contemporaries, in fact almost bang-on contemporaries. So Robert Murray Gilchrist, second story author, was born 1868 and died in 1917, whereas Hector Hugh Munro, whose nom de plume was Saki, was born 1870, said 2 years after Robert Murray Gilchrist, and died 1916, so the year before. Let's say something about Saki first. So it was born in December 1870 in Akyab, Burma, which was part of the British Empire at the time, and his parents were British colonial, whatever you call them, settlers, I don't know. He was a satirist and a writer known for his witty and sometimes macabre, I believe some of you say, satirical short stories. So his mother, weirdly, was killed by a runaway cow, and then he and his brothers and sisters, his siblings, were sent to England to be raised by their grandmother and aunts. Not ants, as in crawly things with legs, but his mother's sister. This strict repressive upbringing would later influence his satirical take on Edwardian society and its conventions. In his youth, he travelled extensively in Europe. He began a career as a journalist and historian. He wrote for papers like the Westminster Gazette, the Daily Express, the Morning Post, which is a Communist Party paper, weirdly. His first book, The Rise of the Russian Empire, was published in 1900. And it was that year that he took the pen name Saki. And people have... there are two theories about this. One is it's the name of a South American monkey species, which it might be, I didn't know. And the other one is it may be from the name of a character in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was a very popular poem at that. It was a great poem, of course, and very popular at that time in translation in English. So sardonic wit, surprise endings, and the somewhat cruel humour. So in his endings, he's a bit like O. Henry, you know, the American short story writer who loved twist endings. And Saki also, these twist endings, and this is an absolute classic version of it, isn't it? Often cruel, and we see this young woman in a time when people write stories, and I think people still are the same now, authors, they either deliberately make a character brutishly cruel or horrible, or even cleverly cruel. I'm thinking of Hannibal Lecter, I suppose, there. But not just casually cruel. Yeah, you see the distinction. So the villain is, or the evil person is, wicked, and they usually revel in their wickedness. And I'm not saying she doesn't. The niece doesn't revel in her wickedness, but this is a casual social cruelty to. This is a guy who's come down for a nerve cure. So this is a guy with anxiety, and she presumably knows that or fishes that out, and the niece, who's 15 years old, deliberately upsets him, but very casually, and it's no big deal, is it? I mean, so she's scared of him about ghosts, and it's a sort of cruel trick that casually might be played. But I think what's interesting, and the point I'm labouring as usual, is that this isn't a wicked protagonist. This is somebody who's just off the cuff cruel, but it works really well. And it leads us down the garden path of a supernatural story, and then twists it and makes us go ha ha ha, or oh, or whichever reaction you had, or I'm bored by that, depending who you are. Now, his most famous stories include this one, The Open Window. We've done Music on the Hill on this, well, I've done this on this channel, Tobermory, which I haven't done, Shredni Vashta, which I haven't done. But is really famous, and you can find it all over YouTube for people narrating it. Some of the people who narrate it are human as well. So, and he'd collected short stories. Reginald, 1904, Reginald in Russia, 1910, Beasts and Super Beasts, great title, 1914, still widely read today. He wrote some novels, The Unbearable Bassington, When William Came, in 1913, being a satirical novel about the German invasion, which is ironic. So, despite his acerbic wit and often cynical worldview in his writing, Saki was known to be a kind and generous person in his personal life. He never married, and there's been speculation about his sexuality, though little concrete evidence exists either way. If you look online, it's kind of widely assumed he was gay, but I don't know that there's any evidence, as he says in my notes. He says, the guy who wrote the notes, there's no evidence. So at the outbreak of World War I, he was 43, and so officially over age. He didn't have to go in the... And this is a gentleman, you know. This is a man who's been born to... You know, people who went out to the colonies were not generally the working classes. They owned tea plantations and rubber plantations, and if they weren't... And they were aspiring, I guess, and they came back usually with some money, and it sounds like... I mean, that he travelled Europe and he became a journalist. He wasn't a poor man. The point about this is he probably could have, because he was a gentleman, he could have enlisted as an officer, but he enlisted as a private in Royal Fusiliers, and he refused the commission. So something going on there. He wrote for the Morning Post, who knows, and was eventually promoted to Lance Sergeant. So on the 14th of November 1916, while serving in France, he was killed by a German sniper. His last words were reportedly, "Put that bloody cigarette out." So a very interesting man, and a really interesting style of writing, I think. a witty writer. I mean, in a sense, you think of somebody like E.F. Benson, who also wrote satirical, not the Edwardian gentry, but I think E.F. Benson is kinder in his writing. He's not as bitchy, if you like. I don't know if that's a right word, but certainly pointed. Okay. Anyway, let's talk about the second dude, who is Robert Murray Gilchrist, and despite his very Scottish-sounding name, he was born in Sheffield. I can't do it, South Yorkshire accent. If I've had a drink, I probably can. But so he was born 1867, like we said. And he spent much of his life in the rugged landscape of the Peak District, which is a kind of part of the Pennines that lies between some of the big cities in the North Midlands, South North, if you like. So Sheffield, in Derbyshire, and bordering on Staffordshire, and bordering on Cheshire, and of course Yorkshire. Anyway, very different kind of writing, of course. Whereas Saki comes across as quite a modern writer. He's not over the top, is he? He's not super gothic. And this is a guy who was a contemporary, pretty much exactly with Robert Murray Gilchrist. And that's interesting because Robert Murray Gilchrist is super gothic and deliberately gothic. His ornate language. He's sort of like Swinburne, or he's reaching back to these Victorian poets, and he's Ernest Dowson or something like that in his language. Almost a little bit Oscar Wilde, but without. I mean, Wilde has very beautiful writing and also a very sardonic and witty and sarcastic wit in his writing as well. So in that sense, Wilde kind of bridges the two authors, bridges Saki and Robert Murray Gilchrist. Literary experts may disagree with me, and I'm not going to defend that position. It just occurred to me there. So he was really popular. He began writing in the 1890s in earnest, and he produced some of his most notable works, particularly Gothic and supernatural fiction, and his short stories, which often featured elements of folklore and the uncanny set against the backdrop of the Derbyshire countryside. Now, he's very interested in topography. You can see that because he describes the landscape, doesn't he? And he uses the place names and the use of place names. So I really like that, because I like the use of place in stories as well, and it roots a story. Although it's interesting because he's rooted the story in real places, but they're not real. It's like what I mean is he takes the day-to-day, ordinary Derbyshire places and makes them weird, which I think's great. Actually, it's not even folk horror. It isn't folk horror. It's gothic. It's gothic. It's colourful gothic, in super goth, really, but he just kind of twists them. Is it Lovecraftian? Lovecraft takes, in some cases, real places. He usually changes the names, and he makes them ordinary places gothic. But I think Robert Murray Gilchrist is right out and out about doing it, and he's bold in his doing it, isn't he? I just think it's really interesting the way he does it, and I like his language. It allows me to go super ham actor. When I was at school, and I was in amateur dramatics, you may not be surprised to hear that, I was ham. And when I played, also this is not related, apart from it happened when I was at school, I was very bad at football. I'm talking about soccer, and I've got very poor eye-hand coordination. I don't know where the ball is, and all I could do was barge people. So I was a really rough player, and in a sense, my acting was the same. There was no finesse to it. It was just turn up the volume, turn up the ham, and I think I did that in this story, which I enjoyed marvellously. I liked both stories a lot, actually. They were different. Anyway, let's go on with his life. So he writes stories. He wrote novels such as Willowbreak, 1898, The Labyrinth, 1902, and he was most famous for his short stories. And he was really famous in his time. And then after he died, it kind of disappeared. But there's been a more renewed interest in his contributions to the Gothic and supernatural recently, and a number of his works have been reprinted, including this one. This is a is it Wordsworth? The Wordsworth Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural. They yeah, Wordsworth Editions, they've produced a whole bunch of reprints of Victorian and Edwardian and early 20th century, I suppose, post-Edwardian ghost and horror story writers, and I've got a whole bunch of them from a bookshop in Aberystwyth, actually, a couple of years ago. Anyway, so during his lifetime, he had a long-term relationship with a man called George Garfitt, and he lived for many years in the village of, I never say it's probably Aham, Derbyshire, and this was not discussed during his lifetime, but of course scholars are interested in it now because of our interest in gender and sexuality now. And he also, so he was definitely a getting back with 90%, 95%. Again, like with Saki, no, we haven't got any photographs and videos. Sorry about that. So he died when he was only 50, 1917. So he was 48. Saki was, I think. And we don't know how he died, because we just don't have any documentation. I'm guessing if we went on Ancestry.com, we could probably find a death certificate for him, but I haven't done that. So he's only 50 and he died, but he suffered from poor health towards the end. He was in good connections with literary figures of his time, including Edward Carpenter and Bram Stoker. I think that was, he's super gothic. Both of them really good, bundled them together. It's still only, even with me yattering on, it's still only going to be short of 40 minutes. So I hope that's okay.